Chapter 268. You're so ugly. Prince Lexi turned around and spoke mercilessly to Mr. Lexi the moment he saw him. Mr. Lexi opened his rotting mouth and laughed silently. He did not seem angry and replied, I'm a fallen person. Of course, I can't compare to you, who is bathed in the glory of the God of Light. Prince Lexi was indeed elegant, handsome, and elegant. Although he was close to 50 years old, he looked like he was only 27 or 28 years old due to his meticulous maintenance and the power of the paladin. His eyes were deep and melancholy, but there was always a faint smile on his lips. He exuded an irresistible charm. But under this charm, there was an extreme danger. As the only living paladin of the San Lorenzo family, Prince Lexi could be said to be the Empire of Light's greatest weapon. Countless enemies of the Empire had died in his hands. There was even a saying in the Empire of Light, the Empire could do without Emperor Reinhardt, but it could not do without Prince Lexi. This saying was actually harsh, but the fact that it could be spread also reflected Prince Lexi's status and prestige in the Empire. However, this paladin of the San Lorenzo family seemed to be on an excursion and did not have a trace of killing intent. He had a faint smile on his face and asked Mr. Lexi. I heard that you have researched a new forbidden spell called Trial's Eye. And you used it to kill Cyril St. Hilda? Yes. Mr. Lexi nodded and stared at Prince Lexi with his remaining right eye, as if he was afraid that the other party would suddenly disappear. Impressive. Prince Lexi praised with a smile, but then he changed the topic and his tone became somewhat sarcastic. But how did you end up like this? Didn't you say that this new forbidden spell only requires the sacrifice of a city and the caster will not have to pay the price? Mr. Lexi's ugly face showed a hint of bitterness and he sighed. After all, it was an experimental forbidden spell. It was also my first time casting it, so there were some miscalculations. Sorry for making a fool of myself. Oh. Where did you make a mistake? Prince Lexi asked with interest. The two of them were like like-minded friends who were exchanging their knowledge of spells. It should be because the number of people sacrificed was not enough, so I suffered some backlash from the forbidden spell. Really? Fallen Eagle City has over 300,000 residents, isn't that enough? Prince Lacey was shocked and asked, then how much is enough? I'm afraid we'll have to sacrifice 500,000 people. Mr. Chang said calmly, as if 500,000 people were no different from 50 lambs in his eyes. Prince Rhy smiled, as if he felt sorry for Mr. Feng. 500,000 people. Such a large city can be counted on one's fingers within the Radiance Empire. Yes. Mr. Chong also seemed to find it a pity, sacrificing these large cities is easier said than done. Furthermore, once the news of Fallen Eagle City spreads, I'm afraid that the defenses of these large cities will be strengthened. Us mages will have even less of a chance. I remember that there are more than 500,000 residents in Yevil, right? Prince Rhy seemed to be trying to help Mr. Chu think of a solution. That's right. Mr. Kuei nodded in agreement when he saw that the other party was encouraging him to sacrifice his mage city. He seemed to really think that this idea was feasible. But then, he shook his head and said, there is no second chance in life. We have to pay the price for our past mistakes, but it is also this price that gives us the opportunity to grow. Prince Rhy smiled even more brightly, well said. Mr. Chang, if I had known you earlier, perhaps we could have become friends. It is my great honor to be your highness friend. Mr. Chang bowed solemnly. Actually, it is not too late to start being friends now. No, it is already too late. Prince Rhy shook his head slowly, the smile on his face gradually disappeared, and his tone became cold, I am here to kill you today. Hearing that a paladin wanted to kill him, Mr. Chang's face was expressionless. Of course, it could also be that his festering face could no longer make any expression. May I ask, why do you want to kill me? Mr. Chang's tone was still as calm as water, as if he was not nervous at all. Why ask when you already know the answer? Prince Rhy's gaze gradually turned cold. When Emperor Reinhardt watched as you stirred up trouble in the northern frontier, I found it strange. And when the Menham family sent their army north, trying to take advantage of the chaos in the northern frontier to establish a kingdom for the dwarves, I confirmed that there was a deal between you and Emperor Reinhardt. Then, what did you use to move my good nephew, to make him stand by and do nothing to help his wife's family, and instead secretly help a family that has a blood feud with the San Lorenzo family? When the news of Fallen Eagle City being burned and the Duke of St. Hilda being killed by a forbidden spell reached my ears, I finally understood. You gave this Trials Eye casting scroll to my good nephew in exchange for his support, right? Mr. Chung did not say anything, tacitly agreeing with Prince Rhy's judgment. At their position, it was very boring to lie forcefully. Prince Rhy sneered, Mr. Chang, when you were trying to curry favor with His Majesty and handed this forbidden spell to him, did you ever think that you would become the public enemy of the Holy Knights because of this? Mr. Chang still did not say anything. His remaining right eye looked straight ahead, but his pupils were a little unfocused, as if, was he distracted? Prince Rhy narrowed his eyes, as if he was angered by Mr. Chang's attitude. The air was filled with an extremely dense murderous aura, as if a landslide was going to happen in the next second. Your Highness. Mr. Chang finally came back to his senses and said calmly, of course, I can understand if you want to kill me. But before that, can you allow me to say a few words in defense? A cold smile appeared on Prince Lacey's face. What? You still want to convince me not to kill you? Mr. Chang nodded. Yes, I want to try. Prince Rhy immediately retracted his murderous aura and elegantly raised his hand to make an inviting gesture. All right, I look forward to your performance. If you can make a determined holy knight change his decision, perhaps your eloquence will be above your arcane skills. Mr. Chang coughed lightly and said unhurriedly, Your Highness, you see my current condition. Your Highness, you've seen my current situation. Due to a miscalculation, I've suffered a backlash from a portion of the forbidden spell. I don't think I'll be able to live much longer. Why do you have to dirty your hands? Prince Rhy was unmoved, clearly dissatisfied with Mr. Chang's reasoning. Mr. Chang was not discouraged and spoke again. Your Highness, since I can give the Scroll of Trials Eye to Emperor Reinhardt, of course I can give one to someone else. If you kill me, aren't you afraid that my mage friend will avenge me? Prince Rhy sneered and said disdainfully, if your mage friend saw your pitiful state, would he still be willing to cast this forbidden spell? Even if he was willing to sacrifice his life for you, why would he sacrifice a city of more than 300,000 people? After the incident at Fallen Eagle City, which lord isn't on guard against you mages? Or is he prepared to burn Yevil to avenge you? Why not? Mr. Chang's expression was calm, but his gaze was firm. Perhaps you don't understand what this forbidden spell means to a mage. Oh. What does it mean? Prince Rhy asked with a smile. It means that we have finally found a glimmer of hope to break free from the shackles on our bodies and wield the power of the sacred domain. After saying this, Mr. Chang's bent back instantly straightened, and his only remaining eye revealed a fanatical glow. Prince Rhy's expression gradually changed, and endless killing intent spread out from his body, causing the space to become stagnant. Mr. Chang tried to persuade him again, Your Highness, do you really want to gamble? But I still want to remind you that our wager is not worth it. My life is worthless, but you are the pillar of the Empire of Light. Prince Rhy's gaze was cold, and he seemed to have made up his mind, Mr. Chang, you're mistaken about something. Oh. What is it? Mr. Chang was puzzled. You shouldn't have tried to threaten a paladin, Prince Rhy said firmly. In the face of threats, never retreat. This is the belief that a paladin should have. Mr. Chang sighed and smiled bitterly, looks like I've made another mistake. The sword at Prince Rhy's waist was unsheathed, and the air seemed to have become sharp at this moment. It doesn't matter, just be careful in your next life. Mr. Chang seemed to have accepted his fate. He looked at Prince Rhy calmly and said, Before I die, can I have one last request? Speak. Mr. Chang raised the magic staff inlaid with a fiery ruby in front of him and said in a clear voice, I want to see your strongest attack. Chapter 269. My strongest attack. Prince Rhy was enveloped in a blinding holy light. At this moment, he seemed to be more dazzling than the sun in the sky. Yes. Mr. Chung closed his only eye, as if he could no longer bear the gaze of his opponent. But his expression was solemn, his back was straight, and his hands were even waving his staff, as if he was preparing some kind of spell. Good. Prince Rhy agreed to Mr. Chang's last request, you are worthy of this attack. As soon as he finished speaking, Prince Rhy's eyes turned completely dark gold. Mysterious and complicated golden patterns crawled all over his face, as if he was wearing a golden mask. The knight's sword was erected in the air in front of him, and the tip of the sword suddenly exploded with a whirlpool of holy light. In an instant, countless golden threads gathered at the whirlpool, as if something terrifying was surging out from within. This sword is called Judgment. Prince Rhy spoke, his voice did not have a trace of human emotion, as if he was a god that was about to destroy the world. But, he did not swing his sword. Because, he realized that Mr. Chung was not waiting for his death, but was also preparing his own spell. The air became hot and dry, and the temperature rose by more than 10 degrees. Mr. Chang's hands turned red, and even made a buzzing sound, as if he was holding on to something extremely hot. The huge ruby inlaid at the top of the staff actually had fine cracks on it. Bang! In the next second, the ruby completely shattered, and countless threads suddenly exploded. A blinding red light slowly rose in front of Mr. Chung. In order to release this spell, Mr. Chung seemed to be draining his life. His face was rotting at a speed visible to the naked eye, and in the blink of an eye, there was not a single piece of intact flesh on his face. His originally straight back bent down again, as if some kind of heavy burden was weighing down on his shoulders. His grey mage robe was already stained red with blood, and it was obvious that Mr. Chang's body was rapidly disintegrating. But, he was still stubbornly chanting the Elvish language, as if he was going to completely burn his life to release this spell. Prince Rhy silently watched his opponent, but the long sword in his hand did not strike. He was waiting. Waiting for Mr. Chang's spell to be completed. In fact, if a mage were to fight a knight one-on-one, the mage would naturally be at a disadvantage. This was because the greater the power of a mage's spell, the more complicated the preparation work needed to be done. On the other hand, knights had already integrated the power of holy light into their bodies and could unleash great power with just a wave of their hands. Like now, Prince Rhy could kill him 1,000 times over before the spell was complete. But strangely, Prince Rhy did not make a move. It was as if he was deliberately waiting for Mr. Jean to complete the spell. Then, he crushed it with his sword. This was the pride of a paladin. It was Prince Lacey's conceit. Even though the spell that Mr. Chung was preparing might be a forbidden spell, Prince Rhy seemed to be prepared to wait. He wanted to see just how beautiful the final song of this respectable opponent would be at the last moment of his life. Boom! Balls of purple flames suddenly rose up and surrounded Mr. Chung. At this moment, Mr. Feng was almost a skeleton. His flesh and blood were rapidly melting away in the demonic purple fire. On his head, his left eye was empty, while his remaining right eye suddenly emitted a beam of green light. Bang! The green light exploded. His only right eye had also disappeared. But Mr. Chang's indifferent voice was heard. Mohasakadura. Prince Rhy was stunned. Previously, Mr. Chang's spell was in Elvish, so he could understand most of it. But now, it was actually Kunya. This was the special language of the High Elves, but it had been lost for thousands of years. A whirlpool of purple flames suddenly appeared in front of Mr. Chang's chest. It seemed to reflect another world. Prince Rhy felt a strong sense of threat. Ever since he became a paladin, he had never felt such a threat. Destroy. Prince Rhy did not hesitate and slowly swung the night sword in his hand. The speed of his sword was extremely slow, but the world seemed to have slowed down. The wind stopped, the flames stopped dancing, and even Mr. Chang's thoughts suddenly froze at this moment. A golden shadow seemed to have transcended the constraints of space and time. It instantly appeared in front of Mr. Chang, slowly tearing apart the whirlpool of purple flames in front of him and crashing into his chest. Bang! It was as if something had shattered. Mr. Chang's body instantly stiffened, and he completely stopped moving. It's over. Prince Rhy sighed in disappointment and was about to withdraw his long sword. But at this moment, the demonic purple flames that were gradually extinguishing suddenly reignited. Boom! The purple flames climbed up Mr. Chang's body and instantly engulfed him. Prince Rhy narrowed his eyes and stared closely at the strange phenomenon in front of him. His heart was filled with shock and vigilance. Holy light gathered at the tip of his sword again. The huge energy seemed to distort the surrounding space. Judgment! Prince Rhy swung his sword again. The golden sword light sank into the purple flames. It seemed to have become fuel, causing the purple flames to surge even more fiercely. Interesting. Prince Rhy's aura suddenly rose. His expression became extremely sincere and determined. Golden patterns instantly crawled all over his body. My heart is the Holy Spirit, my heart is the light. When my heart is fearless, the light can illuminate everything. The prayer seemed to have caused some kind of resonance between heaven and earth. Behind Prince Lacy, a huge shadow slowly gathered. Whoosh! Behind the silhouette, 4 pairs of huge golden wings suddenly spread out, enveloping the entire area within. Judgment of light. A grand and indifferent voice seemed to have come from the shadow behind Prince Rhy. In an instant, light enveloped everything. But when the light reached the extreme, it became darkness. Everyone in the camp only felt a darkness that seemed to have surged out from the depths of their souls and drowned their consciousness. They could not see, hear, or feel anything. But Prince Rhy could still see. He saw that the demonic purple flames were instantly extinguished under the light. But the next moment, it reignited again. And it burned even more fiercely. A crack gradually appeared where Mr. Chang's shattered heart was. Hiss! The crack suddenly opened and swallowed the purple flames. At this moment, Prince Rhy saw that there seemed to be another world hidden behind the crack. It was a boundless green ocean. The surface of the ocean burned with purple flames that seemed to never be extinguished. In the sky above the purple flames, a huge green eye hung high up in the sky. Prince Rhy looked at the huge green eye and felt that it was extremely familiar. A grand and distant voice came from that strange world. When the final judgment arrives, the punished will fall into hell, and the blessed will be reborn. Boom! The crack suddenly closed up. That strange world completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Mr. Chang's body suddenly lost its support and collapsed like a building whose foundation was destroyed. Prince Rhy's face was solemn. The knight's sword in his hand was still unsheathed. But he could not feel Mr. Chang's aura. Dead? Prince Rhy slowly approached and found that Mr. Chang did not have any signs of life. His flesh and blood had completely disappeared, leaving behind only a withered skeleton. But strangely, Mr. Chang's bones had all turned into stone. Crack! Prince Rhy stepped on Mr. Chang's head and crushed it. It was really stone. Prince Lacy stood there in shock and bewilderment for a long time. He did not know what kind of spell Mr. Chang had released, and why it was so strange, but it did not have any offensive power. It was as if Mr. Chang did not burn his life force to counterattack. And Prince Rhy felt that he had been used by the other party. The 3 slashes he made seemed to have become part of the other party's spell. No! Impossible! Immediately, Prince Rhy shook his head. He felt that this idea was too ridiculous. But, that world of purple flames made this holy knight feel uneasy. That huge green eyeball. After pondering for a long time, Prince Rhy finally sheathed his sword. A light breeze blew past, and the camp returned to normal. Prince Rhy's figure was nowhere to be seen. Only the shattered stones and the grey mage robe were left. Is he gone? In the temporary command post, Marquis Dawson asked with lingering fear. He should be gone. Marquis Menam said softly, as if he was afraid of alarming that terrifying existence. Then, Mr. Chong was killed. Should be. In the command post, there was silence again. A group of dwarf nobles lowered their heads, as if thinking about the future of their race. After a long time, Marquis Menam finally stood up and walked out with a heavy expression. Marquis Dawson and the others looked at each other and quickly followed. Chapter 270. Looking at the rubble on the ground, Marquis Menam's face twitched slightly. He suddenly understood that the phrase, obliterated, wasn't an exaggeration. Cough, cough. Collect Mr. Kai's corpse and bury it. Yes. Then Marquis Menham turned to look at Marquis Dawson and asked seriously, what do we do next? What do you think? Marquis Dawson shrugged his shoulders and said helplessly, Mr. Kai is dead, so there's no need to attack Winter Castle. Indeed, the dwarves attacked Winter Castle with the hope of pushing Mr. Kai to the position of Dukes of the North so that the dwarves could establish their kingdom on the northern frontier. But now, Mr. Kai was obliterated, so there was no need to attack. Even if they conquered Winter Castle, would the dwarves dare to occupy the position of Lord of the Northern Frontier? Marquis Menham sighed and looked worried as he asked, what about the establishment of the kingdom? The establishment of the kingdom can be discussed with the House of St. Hilda, Marquis Dawson said in a deep voice, but his tone was lacking in confidence. Will St. Hilda agree? Marquis Menham stroked his beard and looked anxious. We have to try. Marquis Dawson wasn't confident either. Yes, weren't you discussing with the dungeon lords of the northern frontier about the relocation of their territories? How many families agreed? Besides the Angeli family, almost all of them agreed. The situation at the northern frontier was deteriorating, and these families were eager to escape. That's much easier. Marquis Dawson became excited again. You can continue with the relocation of territories. As for the Angeli family, if they don't agree, don't force them. You can find other nearby families. In short, the Menham family will move to the northern frontier. Then, we'll join forces and use peace talks to force the House of St. Hilda to agree to the establishment of the kingdom. If that doesn't work, we can ask Emperor Reinhardt for help. Didn't Emperor Reinhardt promise you? Marquis Menham pondered for a long time before he finally made up his mind. All right, let's test the House of St. Hilda's attitude. With that, he beckoned to a young dwarf beside him. Anka, go to Winter City and see what's going on there. Yes, father. Huayu City. Wind and clouds suddenly surged in the sky above the Phoenix Butterfly Castle. Then, a huge green eye suddenly appeared in the clouds. He suddenly opened his eyes. Time seemed to have stopped for a second before everything returned to normal. Everyone from the Phoenix Butterfly Castle raised their heads in a daze, yet they couldn't see anything unusual. It was as if the pressure that caused one's heart to palpitate was just an illusion. Father. That was. Count Morrison ran into the room sweating profusely, his words full of unconcealable panic. Knight Franco was sitting in a wheelchair, quietly looking at the sea of tulips outside the window, lost in thought. Seeing that Franco did not respond, Count Morrison whispered again, Father. After a long time, Franco opened his mouth and said, Don't ask too much about things that you can't understand or grasp. Count Morrison could only nod and suppress the doubts in his heart. Franco stopped talking and looked deeply in the direction of the bell tower in the distance. At the top of the bell tower, the ancient bell that had experienced 100 years of wind and rain, had unknowingly stopped turning. In the cave below the bell tower, a figure wearing a red mage robe was standing beside the blood pool. His body was rather large, but he had a severe hunchback. His limbs were also abnormally thick. His face was rough, his cheekbones protruding, his mouth was crooked, and his eyes were one big and one small. He looked very ugly. However, this malformed red-robed mage was currently emitting a terrifying aura that caused one's heart to palpitate. Low murmurs that sounded like sleep talk constantly came from the red-robed mage's mouth. The voice seemed to get louder and louder, causing the entire underground cave to shake. Ripples spread out from the center of the blood pool, stirring along with the red-robed mage's hand gestures. The fine ripples gradually became violent, and finally, they set off waves of blood. In the spiderweb above the blood pool, the living people in the cocoons seemed to have been stimulated by something, and immediately began to struggle madly. Boom! The waves of blood surged and engulfed the spiderweb. When the blood pool regained its tranquility, the cocoons were all empty, and the living people inside had completely disappeared. The red-robed mage stopped casting and stared fixedly at the center of the blood pool, as if waiting for something to appear there. After an unknown amount of time, a figure slowly emerged from the blood pool. When the viscous blood slowly slid down, the face of the figure could finally be seen clearly. It was the Duke of St. Hilda. The Duke of St. Hilda, who had been petrified, actually recovered from his petrified state at this moment. Then, he opened his eyes. For a moment, it was as if lightning flashed in the cave, and it was as if a red sun had fallen into it. The red-robed mage seemed to be unable to bear the light and had no choice but to close his eyes. Ha ha ha! We did it, we did it! Ha ha ha! The red-robed mage laughed loudly. He was extremely excited, and even a little deranged. He let out an incomprehensible roar from his mouth, and waved his arms and legs wildly, venting the joy in his heart. After a moment, the light dissipated. The red-robed mage also gradually recovered from his madness. He opened his eyes again, and revealed an ugly smile to the Duke of St. Hilda, who had come back from the dead. Mr. Chi, we did it. The Duke of St. Hilda also revealed a smile, and said, Horace, we did it. His smile was a little strange, as if he was still unable to perfectly control the muscles on his face, and his speech was not very clear. However, this scene made one's hair stand on end. Mr. Chi, who should have been killed by Prince Lehigh, had instead used the corpse of the Duke of St. Hilda to come back from the dead. How does the Holy Knight's body feel? The red-robed mage, Horace, asked anxiously. He looked at the body of the Duke of St. Hilda, his eyes full of envy. The Duke of St. Hilda, no, it should be Mr. Chi, stretched this body. He faced the sky, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes in enjoyment. He said with a satisfied expression, as expected of the strongest individual of the human race, the Holy Knight. I can feel that this body is filled with explosive power. Moreover, this is the feeling of breaking free from the shackles. Then, Mr. Chi raised his right hand, and a red light flashed in his eyes. He did not seem to be chanting any spells, but a ball of purple fire rose from his hand. The purple fire danced continuously, and a boundless pressure filled the underground cavern. Even the blood pool became turbulent once again. Hey! Be careful, don't collapse this place. Horace shouted loudly. Then, he pointed at Mr. Chi's body, and reminded him, don't collapse this Holy Knight's body, which was obtained with great difficulty. Mr. Chi retracted his spell and looked down. He saw that there were small cracks on his new body, and golden blood was seeping out from them. It was a horrifying sight. But the most horrifying thing was the terrifying scar on the Duke of St. Hilda's chest that almost split him in two. Mr. Chi knew that this was the wound that the Holy Knight of the Troll Empire, Prince Otto, had left on the Duke of St. Hilda. After this torment, this wound had become even more serious, as if it would completely collapse in the next moment. Mr. Chi smiled faintly, and did not panic. It seems that the first thing we need to do is to repair this body. Horace stroked his chin and frowned. This is really troublesome. It will require a lot of precious materials, and it will probably take 2 to 3 years. Mr. Chi was not in a hurry. He smiled and said, "Then let's take it slow." "Take it slow?" Horace said in surprise. "After 2 to 3 years, who knows what the northern frontier will be like? Your House of St. Thean has planned for so long, and you're giving up just like that?" Mr. Chi chuckled and shook his head. "When I sacrificed the entire fallen Eagle City, I was already destined to have no fate with the Dukes of the North. The people of the northern frontier will never accept a demon, a madman, as their ruler." Horace seemed to have understood something and said, "So, this resurrection plan was not your last resort at all. Instead, it was your real goal from the very beginning." Mr. Chi nodded. "That's right. From the beginning, I did not expect to use this method to seize the northern frontier. The House of St. Thean has been in exile for more than 300 years. Without their own army and vassal knights, they would not be able to secure their position as the ruler of the northern frontier. So, my true goal has always been this holy knight's body. Only by occupying this body can I break through the limits of the Saint Realm." Horace's expression changed slightly, and he said in a low voice, "Aren't you afraid that something will go wrong with the forbidden spell you developed? I admit that Trials I and Final Judgment, these two interrelated forbidden spells, are indeed genius ideas. However, they are new forbidden spells that have just been developed. If something goes wrong, won't you?" Mr. Chi looked indifferent, and said faintly, "If I don't even dare to take this risk, how can I resist the false god?" Horace was silent. Seeing this, Mr. Chi spoke again, "Are you afraid?" Horace raised his eyebrows and laughed loudly. "What am I afraid of? You even dared to try such a dangerous forbidden spell, of course I won't back down." "Good." Mr. Chi nodded with satisfaction, his eyes deep. "The shackles that have been binding us mages for thousands of years, it's time to completely smash them." Horace's ugly face was flushed with excitement, and he was about to howl for this exciting and grand goal when Mr. Chi suddenly took out a ball-shaped object and threw it over, saying, "Go to Imperial Dragon City and give this to Emperor Reinhardt." "What is this?" Horace looked at the eyeball in his hand and asked with a puzzled expression. "This is a gift I give to my allies," Mr. Chi said with a smile full of meaning. "It is also the first step of our rebellion plan." Chapter 271. The majestic Lion's Roar Castle looked even more desolate under the afterglow of the setting sun. Colin and Vera were standing side by side on the balcony of the main castle as they enjoyed the beautiful scenery of the sunset. Vera was wearing a palace-style strapless dress today, revealing her round shoulders and slender neck. Her long blonde hair was tied up casually, and her fair and smooth skin made people want to kiss her. The afterglow of the setting sun outlined her perfect side profile, and Colin was a little entranced. "What are you looking at?" Vera turned her head and smiled at her husband. "I am looking at the future Dukes of the North," Colin teased with a smile. Vera rolled her eyes cutely and said with a slightly worried tone, "There is still a rebellion in the northern frontier. Moreover, I don't know if the Emperor and the Senate will agree to let me inherit the title of Duke." Colin was about to comfort his wife when he heard footsteps behind him. Immediately, the new butler of the House of St. Hilda, Bataille, came to the balcony and bowed to report. "Miss, Viscount Angley, the messenger of the dwarf has arrived." Vera slowly turned around and nodded, "Good. Ask him to come in." Colin also turned around and saw a familiar dwarf walking in. "Dear Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, Anka, the son of Marquis Menham. I would like to extend my most sincere greetings to you." When Colin heard the dwarf's name and self-introduction, he suddenly remembered that he had met Count Anka in Ice Stone City. When he had just returned from the Troll Empire, he had met the dwarf count at the triumphant return banquet. The dwarf count had also proposed to exchange part of the Menham family's territory in the Flaming Flame territory for the Angeli family's territory. "Count Anka, please have a seat." Vera returned the greeting and then invited the dwarf to sit at a small round table on the balcony. The maid brought coffee and desserts at the right time. Colin also sat down at the table, sipped his coffee, and asked with a smile, Count Anka, did you come this time for the matter of the territory exchange? Count Anka paused for a moment, then shook his head awkwardly. That's not it. Furthermore, the transfer of territory requires mutual consent. If you are not willing, the Menham family will not force you. Colin raised his eyebrows, a little surprised by Count Anka's weak attitude. Back in Ice Stone City, this dwarven count was quite arrogant. One moment, he said that he wouldn't let the Angeli family suffer any losses. The next moment, he said that the Menham family's army was about to arrive at the northern frontier. He almost forced Colin's hand to sign. There had to be a reason for Count Anka's change in attitude. Could it be that the dwarves felt that they couldn't conquer Chilly Winter Castle and were prepared to negotiate? Why did you come to Chilly Winter Castle? Count Anka glanced at Vera and saw that she was silently sipping her coffee and eating her desserts. She didn't seem interested in this conversation. This attitude made Count Anka understand that Viscount Angli was the true owner of Chilly Winter Castle. Miss Vera, Viscount Angli, I came this time to reach a peace agreement with you and put an end to the chaos at the northern frontier. Peace agreement? Colin raised his eyebrows and looked seriously at Count Anka. The dwarves actually wanted to negotiate. Colin started to plan in his heart. Actually, at this moment, Colin was wavering between war and peace. Initially, Scholar Dwayne's plan was indeed a wise and prudent one. However, after severely weakening the Dawson family at the Rapid Flow River and defeating the Oman family's army in cold winter, Colin had the confidence to fight against the dwarven army. That was why he wrote a letter to Ice Stone City and asked the main forces of the Black Cavalry and the Silvermoon Guard to rush over. However, he didn't expect that just as he was about to fight to the death with the dwarves would suddenly cower. This made Colin feel as though he had punched the air. Tell me your conditions. Colin decided to observe the situation first. Count Anka was energized and immediately said, Your Excellency Viscounts, the Menham family has no intention of becoming enemies with the House of St. Hilda. We are also very willing to see a peaceful northern frontier. Therefore, as long as you agree to our request to establish an independent kingdom, the dwarven army outside the city will immediately retreat. The House of St. Hilda will also obtain the eternal friendship and gratitude of the dwarves. Colin stroked his chin. He wasn't surprised by this condition. Wasn't this group of dwarves causing trouble with Mr. Roland for such a long time for this goal? However, why would they give up on the St. Thean family and turn to cooperate with the House of St. Hilda? Colin immediately realized that something must have happened in the other party's camp. Otherwise, the dwarves wouldn't have planned to negotiate for peace without even trying to attack the city. You want to establish an independent kingdom on the northern frontier? Yes. What about the territory? Count Anka was already prepared. When he heard this, he immediately took out a map from his bosom and spread it out on the table, introducing it. Miss Vera, Viscount Angli, please take a look. This is the territory of the Dwarven Kingdom in our plan. It includes the current territory of the Dawson family, the Lamba family, and the Billy family. Please rest assured, other than the Dawson family, the other leaders of the northern frontier have all agreed to exchange territories with the Menham family. Wait. Colin immediately interrupted Count Anka and asked, Agreed? Who agreed to exchange territories with the Menham family? Count Anka's heart skipped a beat, and he said carefully, Viscount Angli, these leaders have all agreed. Moreover, we have obtained Great Emperor Reinhardt's permission. Colin wasn't moved. He said coldly, What about the House of St. Hilda? Have you forgotten who is the leader of the northern frontier? Count Anka smiled apologetically and said, That's why I came to Chilly Winter. I want to obtain the approval of the House of St. Hilda. Vera didn't even lift her head when she heard this. She didn't seem interested in Count Anka's suggestion. Colin placed his coffee cup on the table heavily and said in an unfriendly tone, Count Anka, the Menham family has just arrived at the northern frontier, and you're preparing to take away such a large territory to establish an independent kingdom. I'm afraid you don't care about the house of Saint Hilda. The corners of Count Anka's mouth twitched, as if he was suppressing the anger in his heart. However, he still forced a smile and defended himself. How can that be? The Menham family has always respected the house of Saint Hilda. This time, we have obtained Great Emperor Reinhardt's permission to establish our kingdom. After establishing our kingdom, the Dwarf Kingdom will be the eternal partner of the house of Saint Hilda. Partner? Colin smiled coldly. But the house of Saint Hilda doesn't need partners like you. If you were a vassal, I would consider it. How about this? If the Menham family swears allegiance to the house of Saint Hilda, the northern frontier will allow you to settle down there. Count Anka's face turned gloomy. He seemed to have lost his patience with Colin. Therefore, he turned to Vera and asked directly. Miss Vera, is this also your intention? Vera lifted her head and looked at Count Anka calmly. She nodded seriously and said, this is my intention. This is also the will of the house of Saint Hilda. Count Anka was finally enraged. He stood up immediately and said loudly. I came here with good intentions, but I did not expect to receive such strong hostility. Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, I understand what you mean. I will definitely inform my father and let him make the decision. Thank you for your hospitality. Goodbye. After he finished speaking, Count Anka bowed perfunctorily and left with large strides. Colin frowned as he looked at Count Anka's back. He said to Vera, who was beside him. I think that something must have happened to the dwarves. Otherwise, they would not have come to negotiate with us so early. Their attitude was also very low. I deliberately provoked them a few times before they finally left. Vera laughed and patted Colin's arm. She smiled and said, I also thought that it was strange. Are they really the dwarves who are famous for their bad temper? They actually tolerated you for so long. It seems that the other party is really anxious to negotiate with us. Colin stretched his body and said leisurely, whatever the enemy wants to do, we cannot let them succeed so easily. So, there is no need to rush. If they are really sincere about negotiating with us, they will come again. Vera thought for a moment before she said, I think that the change in the dwarves' side may be related to the arcane fluctuation that I detected this morning. Oh. Colin's heart skipped a beat. Then, have you figured out what happened this morning outside the city? It was too far away, so I do not know what it was. Vera shook her head. Then, she suggested, maybe we can ask our teacher. Mage Kudos. Colin thought for a moment before he nodded. Okay, I will go and see if he knows anything. Chapter 272. When Colin found Wizard Cusius, he was playing with a canary. He was relaxed and carefree, just like a retired old man. This 6th-rank wizard had been following Colin and the others ever since they coincidentally met, but he had also been acting like a bystander. Although the other party had confessed his relationship with Mr. Cusius and even handed over a Trials Eye casting scroll, Colin was still wary of Cusius. Now that the situation in the northern frontier was gradually improving, Colin was ready to have a showdown with this person. He couldn't just leave this unknown friend or foe by his side and not deal with him, right? Good evening, Mr. Cusius. You are in a good mood. Good evening, Viscount Angley. Cusius turned around and invited Colin to take a seat. After some small talk, Cusius went straight to the point. Sir Viscounts, are you here because of the arcane energy waves outside the city this morning? Colin nodded and asked, that's right. Do you know what's going on? Cusius shook his head, my apologies, Sir Viscounts. I am actually very curious about what happened outside the city, but I was so far away. I only know that someone released an extremely powerful spell, but I can't guess anything else. Colin was slightly disappointed, but he immediately asked, extremely powerful? How powerful? Could it be a forbidden spell? It is possible. However, Sir Viscounts, the release of a forbidden spell is not that simple. A trace of struggle appeared on Cusius' face, but it was quickly replaced by determination. You must be very curious as to why I abandoned Mr. Cusius and turned to the house of St. Hilda. Colin was slightly stunned, obviously not expecting the other party to take the initiative to expose this layer of window paper. Although Colin had suspected that Cusius was involved in Mr. Cusius' plan to sacrifice Fallen Eagle City, he did not point it out because of his identity as Vera's teacher. He did not expect Cusius to take the initiative to admit it now. "I'm a little curious," Colin said casually. Wizard Cusius looked seriously into Colin's eyes and said honestly, "Sir Viscounts, before I came to you, I met Mr. Feng once." Colin did not speak, quietly waiting for Wizard Kudos to continue. At that time, Mr. Chang's condition was very bad. Colin's curiosity was piqued. He asked, "How bad?" "He lost his left eye, but that was part of the plan, because that was the price he had to pay to release the trial's eye. But when I saw him, the entire left side of his face had been completely corroded. Moreover, even though he tried to hide it, I could still sense the aura of death around him. So, I immediately realized that Mr. Kuei was still suffering from the backlash of the forbidden spell. The sacrifice of Fallen Eagle City was not enough to completely eliminate the backlash of the forbidden spell. He messed it up." Colin's eyes flashed, as if he had understood something. "So, that's why you handed over the trial's eye casting scroll so readily. You realized that compared to other forbidden spells, this forbidden spell did not have a qualitative improvement, and it still required the caster to pay a terrible price." Cusius nodded, but then shook his head. "Mr. Cusius' state at that time really surprised me, but if you say that the trial's eye did not have a qualitative improvement, then you are underestimating Mr. Cusius. You must know that to be able to kill a holy knight, trial's eye is already a true 8th rank forbidden spell. If a forbidden spell of this level were to be cast using normal methods, I'm afraid that 7 or 8 6th rank mages would have to work together to cast it, sacrificing their own lives. But for Mr. Cusius to be able to cast the spell with his own strength and not die on the spot, this is already a great success." Hearing this, Colin laughed coldly and retorted, "His own strength? Have you forgotten the 300,000 citizens of Fallen Eagle City?" Cusius' expression was somewhat awkward. He coughed lightly and immediately apologized. "My apologies, Lord Viscounts, I did not intentionally leave out those innocent lives, it's just that." Cough cough. From an academic point of view, the forbidden spell that Mr. Cusius researched is indeed an extremely important breakthrough. The coldness in Colin's eyes did not decrease in the slightest. Cusius' perfunctory attitude made him understand that he was just like Mr. Cusius, a demon without a bottom line in his heart. If the trial's eye really did not have a negative effect on the caster, this guy would definitely not hesitate to use it when he had the chance. However, although he had already sentenced Cusius to death in his heart, on the surface, Colin did not continue to pester him. Seeing this, Cusius relaxed. Perhaps in his eyes, those lowly commoners were no more than insignificant ants in the eyes of a noble like Colin. Thus, Cusius continued, "If you understand Mr. Cusius, you will understand that he is definitely an arcane genius. That year, he became a 6th-level mage at the age of 27, directly creating a historical record in Yevil. However, because mages are unable to become saints, Mr. Cusius also faced a desperate situation where he had nowhere to go. Thus, he began to research various forbidden spells, which led to the creation of the Trial's Eye, which could be said to have changed the course of arcane history." Colin looked at the fanatical Cusius and laughed coldly in his heart. Yes, Mr. Cusius had created the sacrificial forbidden spell. However, whether this was a path to glory or a prelude to depravity for mages, that was hard to say. Cusius continued. Even if there were some mistakes, it was actually unavoidable. After all, this was the first time such a brand new forbidden spell was released, but this has already opened up a new path of arcane research that is full of hope. Since you admire Mr. Cusius so much, why did you betray him? Colin interrupted the other party's flattery. Cusius smiled bitterly, because I feel that Mr. Cusius' fate will be very tragic. Oh. Why? Firstly, he himself suffered from the backlash of the forbidden spell, and does not know how long he can live. Secondly. Cusius hesitated, but in the end, he still spoke. On the day of the sacrificial ritual in Fallen Eagle City, I was actually outside the city. Mr. Cusius asked me to help him block any possible disturbances. At that time, I was rather curious as to who Mr. Cusius was guarding against. Later, I found out that the chairman of the Yevil Mage Council, Mage Ernest, had actually appeared outside Fallen Eagle City. Obviously, someone had informed Ernest of Mr. Cusius' plan, and this person is most likely Emperor Reinhardt. Colin listened quietly, without any expression. Cusius continued, I'm guessing that Emperor Reinhardt is actually quite wary of Mr. Chong. Since he obtained the Trials Eye casting scroll and verified its effectiveness, Mr. Chong shouldn't be of much use to him. Therefore, although he is bound by his promise and will not personally send people to kill Mr. Cusius, it is very likely that he will reveal Mr. Cusius' whereabouts to others. Due to the terrifying power of the Trials Eye, there must be many people who want to kill Mr. Cusius. For example, Ernest, Prince Rhy. Outside Fallen Eagle City, I helped Mr. Cusius block Ernest, but Prince Rhy. I don't think Mr. Cusius can escape his pursuit. Colin's eyes flashed, and he said, You think that the arcane spell explosion this morning could be caused by Prince Rhy's arrival? There is such a possibility. Cusius shrugged, the last time we met, I also asked Mr. Cusius if he had a way to deal with Prince Rhy's pursuit. But he did not say anything. Either he does not trust me enough, or he himself has not thought of a way to deal with it. No matter what the situation is, I feel that there is no need for me to follow him down this path to the end. Seeing that Colin was deep in thought, Cusius coughed lightly, and said with a slightly flattering tone, Viscount Angley, I have already told you everything I know. Please believe me, when I assisted Mr. Cusius, it was only to understand the true effects of the Trials Eye forbidden spell. It was purely academic research, and I had no other intentions. Even at that time, I did not know that Mr. Cusius' target was actually the Duke of St. Hilda. Colin glanced at Cusius, not knowing if he believed his nonsense. Cusius was a little nervous, but he continued, with my relationship with Vera, of course, I would not deliberately harm the Duke of St. Hilda. If I had known that Mr. Cusius' target was the Duke of St. Hilda, I would have stopped him with all my might. Cough cough, I am also very sorry about the death of the Duke. So, to make up for it, I am willing to become the magic consultant of the House of St. Hilda. Colin sneered in his heart. This guy probably saw that the situation at the northern frontier was gradually becoming clearer, and that the House of St. Hilda was not in danger of collapsing, so he shamelessly came forward to become a magic consultant. However, this was probably the best way out for Cusius at the moment. First, he offended the chairman of the Mage Council, Ernest. Then, when he saw that the future of Mr. Cusius' side was bleak, he had no choice but to completely turn to the House of St. Hilda. I will pass on your request to Vera. Colin suppressed the disgust in his heart and smiled perfunctorily. After that, the two of them chatted briefly before Colin took his leave. Walking along the dim corridor, Colin suddenly smelled a familiar fragrance. After turning a corner, Colin suddenly realized that Archbishop Ajani was walking towards him. Good evening, Viscount Angley. Ajani smiled sweetly, like 100 flowers blooming together. Good evening, Your Excellency. Colin felt that the scene now was somewhat familiar. 2 days ago, they seemed to have met like this by chance. I just received a piece of good news. Would you like to hear it? Ajani slowly walked towards Colin. Under the dim light, her beautiful face flickered between light and darkness, exuding a fatal charm. Oh. What good news? Tell me about it. Colin stopped in his tracks. But Ajani was still getting closer and closer. The fragrance of the roses became stronger and stronger, drilling straight into the depths of Colin's heart. Finally, Ajani stood less than half a meter away from Colin. She raised her head slightly, and her watery peach blossom eyes stared fixedly at Colin. Her red lips opened slightly, and a piece of news shook Colin's heart. Mr. Cusius is dead. Chapter 273. How did he die? Although Colin had already guessed this possibility, he still couldn't help but be greatly shocked, and the news really came out from a Johnny's mouth. Prince Rhy killed him. Akani stared into Colin's eyes, as if trying to find something. This morning, in the dwarf army's camp outside the city. As expected. Colin looked calm on the surface, but in his heart, he was in a state of shock. Prince Rhy. A holy knight at his peak was indeed terrifying. He entered an army of tens of thousands and killed a level 6 wizard as easily as crushing an ant. No wonder Emperor Reinhardt was so wary of this prince, to the extent that he was willing to betray his wife's family to obtain a bargaining chip that could keep him in check. However, Prince Rhy's response was domineering. He found Mr. Rhy and killed him without hesitation. This was probably a warning to Emperor Reinhardt. However, to the House of St. Hilda, Prince Rhy was a great help. With Mr. Rhy dead, the northern frontier could no longer be overturned. Apart from Mr. Rhy, the House of St. Theon did not have any other outstanding figures. With the fall of this pillar, even if there were still some powerful figures, they would probably be so scared that they would go into hiding, not daring to show their faces again. Without the House of St. Theon, the rebellion at the northern frontier would lose its source. Even though the Dawson and Menham families were still entrenched outside Winter Castle, they could no longer shake the foundations of the House of St. Hilda. The dukes of the Empire's 4 territories were all from Holy Knight families. There had never been an exception. If the dwarves wanted to be an exception, their fate would be extremely miserable. They were now thinking of how to persuade the House of St. Hilda to allow the dwarves to establish their own country. It was no wonder that the dwarven messenger, Count Anka, was so humble. Moreover, Colin was even more certain that even if they didn't come to an agreement, the dwarves would send another messenger. The initiative was now back in the hands of the House of St. Hilda. Viscount Angley, what are you thinking about? Colin came back to his senses and saw that Agiani was looking at him with bright eyes, her deep blue eyes full of probing. I'm thinking about how to deal with the remaining rebels. Have you made up your mind? Colin smiled and asked, Your Excellency, how do you think we should deal with those dwarven rebels? Akani's expression was indifferent, a dreamy color floating in her beautiful big eyes. She piously said, The God of Light appreciates forgiveness, but he also values punishment. Forgiveness earns praise, punishment earns awe. Colin smiled, understanding Akani's meaning. In fact, this archbishop had been encouraging the House of St. Hilda to fight to the death with the dwarven army from the very beginning. When Earl Amon controlled Winter Castle, she had the same attitude. Do you have some grudges with the dwarves? Colin asked with a smile. Ajani shook her head and said, I have no prejudice against dwarves. However, I do not wish to see the establishment of the dwarven kingdom. Oh. Why? Akani did not answer directly this time, but asked, Your Excellency Viscounts, are you willing to see the dwarves establish an independent kingdom on the northern frontier? Of course I am not willing, because this is the northern frontier. Whether it is as the Lord of the Northern Frontier or as Vera's husband, I have reasons to oppose any attempt to divide the Northern Frontier. But, what is your reason? In the face of Colin's doubts, Akani's eyes flashed and she said softly, As the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier Diocese, I certainly do not wish to see the Northern Frontier divided. I see. Colin nodded slowly, understanding Akani's motive. Then we are allies. Of course. Akani nodded, once again blooming with a perfect smile. Colin's mouth was dry, but he quickly calmed himself down and maintained his vigilance. He asked again, What's the matter? He asked again, then, as an ally, should I also do my part to prevent the dwarves from establishing an independent kingdom? The smile on Akani's face became even more brilliant, coupled with the strong holy aura around her body, she appeared even more charming. Your Excellency Viscounts, how do you want me to do my part? Colin took a deep breath, his nose filled with the strong scent of a mature woman. You were able to find out about Prince Leahy killing Mr. Roland so quickly because you have spies in the Dwarven army, right? Akani was slightly stunned, but she quickly regained her composure and said lightly, the God of Light has loyal believers in every corner of the world. This should be considered as an admission. However, Colin was indeed quite impressed by the Church of Light's ability to gather information. He had experienced it once in Icestone City because of Vera. He did not expect that they would also have fanatics in the Dwarven army who would inform the Church. This pervasive method of infiltration was indeed unsolvable. Especially among the dwarves, this was even more rare. Although the dwarves had always believed in the God of Light had not given them the glory they deserved, they could not be baptized into knights. Therefore, the proportion of fanatics among the dwarves was definitely not high. But even so, the Dwarven army outside the city was like taking off their clothes in front of the church, with no secrets to speak of. I need to borrow this loyal believer of yours, Colin suggested with a smile. Akani looked hesitant and said, what do you want to do? You must know that this believer has already taken a great risk in order to pass on information to the church. I cannot let him be sacrificed so casually. It was not that he could not be sacrificed, but that he could not be sacrificed casually. Colin understood what she meant. She was worried that his method was not reliable. Please rest assured, of course I will not let a loyal believer of the God of Light die. Then what is your plan? Colin smiled and suddenly leaned close to Akani's ear. The beautiful Archbishop was shocked. Just as she was about to back away, she heard Colin whispering in her ear, and immediately froze on the spot. However, her small and delicate ears were turning pink at a speed visible to the naked eye. Colin laughed coldly in his heart, who asked you to keep provoking me, now it's my turn to fight back. Moreover, this archbishop who had always maintained a pure and pious attitude was not really as calm as still water, without a trace of mortal desires. After explaining his plan, Colin once again pulled away from the two of them, and gave the rosy Akani what he thought was the most gentlemanly smile. But in Akani's eyes, this smile was especially hateful. Akani seemed to be angry at her loss of composure just now, and glared fiercely at Colin. However, she didn't know how alluring this glance was. How confident are you that you can succeed? Colin crossed his arms and smiled confidently, since I dare to make such a suggestion, I naturally have enough confidence. Your Excellency Archbishop, do you not have confidence in me? Akani stared at Colin for a moment, and finally nodded, of course I have confidence in you. Good. Colin stretched out his hand, to a happy cooperation. To a happy cooperation. Akani did not hesitate, and stretched out her hand to shake Colin's. The warm and soft touch made Colin's heart beat faster. Unfortunately, Akani only shook Colin's hand lightly, and then immediately withdrew her delicate hand. Colin was disappointed, and when he saw that the other party was about to turn and leave, he opened his mouth again. By the way, Your Excellency Archbishop, the Duke's body has been delayed for too long, Vera and I hope that you can hold his funeral as soon as possible. Akani immediately stopped in her tracks, her large blue eyes staring at Colin once more. When the Duke's body had just entered the city, she had already felt that something was wrong. Moreover, she had also heard from Earl Oman that the Duke's body had been swapped, so Colin's intention was very obvious. This was because he was worried that the problem with the body would be discovered, and he wanted to bury the body as soon as possible, so that the news of the Duke's death could be concluded. Colin did not seem to be guilty, and looked at Akani openly, as if he did not have any selfish motives, and only hoped that the Duke of St. Hilda could be buried as soon as possible. Finally, a smile bloomed on Akani's pretty face again, and she nodded. Good. After dealing with the dwarf rebels, I will hold the funeral for the Duke of St. Hilda. Chapter 274. As Colin expected, the next day, the dwarves sent a messenger to Winter Castle. It was an old acquaintance, Earl Anka. Both times, the Menham family came to Winter Castle to negotiate. This showed that Marquis Dawson had been marginalized in the dwarf army. This time, Vera and Colin met Earl Anka in the greenhouse. Of course, the one who led the negotiations was Colin. Vera was concentrating on the blood rose that she had recently planted. Viscount Angley, I have conveyed Miss Vera and your intentions to my father. My father understands your concerns. However, please believe that the dwarves have no intention of becoming enemies with the House of St. Hilda. However, our will to establish an independent country is equally firm. In order to make up for the losses at the northern frontier, my father is willing to give up a portion of his territory. Earl Anka took out a map of the northern frontier and showed it to Colin. From the Rapids River to the Poplar Forest, we are willing to unconditionally transfer the territory to the House of St. Hilda. In addition, the Dwarf Kingdom will sign an alliance treaty with the northern frontier. As long as the Duke of St. Hilda orders, the dwarves will send troops to assist. Moreover, the Menham family will pay 1.5 million gold coins to the House of St. Hilda every year. Viscount Angley, this is the annual tax that a marquis pays to his lord. Therefore, besides not swearing allegiance to the House of St. Hilda, the Menham family has fulfilled the obligations of a vassal of the northern frontier. You can even consider the Dwarf Kingdom as a part of the northern frontier, and the dwarves are still citizens of the northern frontier. Colin rubbed his chin and was deep in thought. In order to reach an agreement with the House of St. Hilda, the Menham family had made a lot of concessions. However, Colin was still not satisfied. Whether it was the so-called alliance agreement, the annual tribute, or even the ceding of territory, nothing could change the fact that the dwarves wanted to divide the northern frontier. As long as the dwarf king did not swear allegiance to the Duke of St. Hilda, the House of St. Hilda would have no binding power over the dwarves, and the dwarf kingdom would remain a separatist force. These conditions are not enough. Colin shook his head coldly. Count Anka pursed his lips and asked patiently, "What other conditions do you want?" "We can discuss them." Colin said calmly, "I want the Dwarf King to accept the title conferred by the Duke of St. Hilda and swear allegiance to the Duke of St. Hilda." "This is impossible." Count Anka refused without hesitation. "The Dwarf King will only swear loyalty to Emperor Reinhardt." Colin shrugged and spread his hands. "Then there's nothing to discuss." Count Anka resisted the urge to beat up Colin. He took a few deep breaths and said in a low voice, "Viscount Angley, we dwarves came with goodwill, but we did not expect you to trample on our goodwill. You have to know that we dwarves have been waiting for thousands of years to build a kingdom. Please do not underestimate our determination. Also, do not think that we dwarves will only compromise. Our weapons are still sharp, and our warriors still thirst for blood." Colin looked quietly at Count Anka, who was on the verge of exploding. He suddenly smiled and said, "Is Mr. Kerr dead?" Count Anka was stunned. His big round eyes rolled a few times before he nodded helplessly and said, "Yes." Prince Rhy had killed Mr. Kerr in public, so it was impossible to hide it. Count Anka also knew that Winter City would find out about this sooner or later. But he did not expect it to be so fast. The Menham family was so eager to negotiate because they wanted to conclude the negotiations before the news of Mr. Kerr's death reached the House of St. Hilda. Unfortunately, they were still too late. Count Anka sighed inwardly. He finally understood why Colin was so unyielding. Colin saw that Count Anka's expression was gradually turning gloomy. He smiled as he took the map of the northern frontier and drew a new circle on it. "I can agree to the dwarves building a kingdom, but the territory you agreed to cede is far from enough. I want this land." Count Anka hurriedly looked over, but then he frowned and said hesitantly, "Viscount Angley, the land you drew, is the marquis territory of the Dawson family, right?" "Yes." Colin had a matter-of-fact look on his face. Count Anka narrowed his eyes and shook his head. This is impossible. The Dawson family will not agree to such conditions. Colin chuckled. But the one negotiating with me now is not the Dawson family. Count Anka finally understood what Colin meant. He was instigating the Menham family to betray their ally. The dwarf count lowered his head and did not speak. He was struggling internally. Seeing this, Colin opened his mouth again. Friend Dawson betrayed Marquis Garcia and the Black Cavalry. The House of St. Hilda will not forgive such hatred. So, if you want to reach an agreement with us, you have to hand over Marquis Dawson. Furthermore, I believe that the dwarf race must be deeply ashamed of such a traitor. Could it be that the Menham family is prepared to build a kingdom of dwarves with such a person? Oh, right, I also heard that Marquis Dawson claimed to be the successor of the former dwarf king Selinsky. Could it be that you are prepared to push him to the position of dwarf king? What right does he have to be the dwarf king? Count Anka said with disdain. Colin smiled proudly. Then what are you hesitating for? Count Anka was silent for a while before he spoke again. If we hand over Marquis Dawson and give up the Marquisate, the House of St. Hilda will agree to the Menham family building a kingdom of dwarves. That's right. Colin nodded seriously. Count Anka seemed to be a little worried, and he turned to look at Vera. Vera also turned around and said in a low voice, Yes, Count Anka, these are our conditions. Marquis Dawson must pay the price for his betrayal. Count Anka calmed down a little, but he did not dare to agree to such conditions. However, his reaction did not seem to be too resistant. After all, they had betrayed the Dawson family, and the Menham family's interests were not harmed. Instead, they had one less competitor. Seeing this, Colin had an idea. He opened a piece of parchment, wrote down the contents of the agreement, and handed it to Count Anka. You can take this agreement back and show it to Marquis Menham. If he agrees, you can sign it. Count Anka put away the parchment, nodded, and left in a hurry. In the greenhouse, Vera put down the potted plants in her hands and asked worriedly, Do you think that Marquis Menham will agree to such conditions? Colin smiled and said, Whether he agrees or not, I have a way to deal with it. Vera was relieved. She had almost blind faith in Colin. After all, no matter what problems they faced, Colin always had a way to solve them. I hope that father can personally execute Marquis Dawson. Vera gritted her teeth and said angrily. The father she was talking about was, of course, Marquis Garcia. Of course, no problem. After the dwarves are dealt with, it is almost time to exchange prisoners with the eastern region. You should be able to see Marquis Garcia again very soon. Okay. Vera fiddled with the rose petals in front of her, and her heart was filled with thoughts of her father. Today, Vera was wearing a milky white tube top pleated skirt, and her bright blonde hair was tied up with many naughty twirls at the end of her hair. The girl used a red hair band to hold her hair in place. Colin stepped forward and hugged Vera in his arms. He did not say anything, but he just gently stroked his wife's back. Vera also hugged Colin's waist and buried her face in his warm chest. Both of them did not say anything, and they quietly enjoyed this sweet and warm moment. On the other side, Count Anka hurriedly returned to the dwarven camp outside the city. Father, this is the condition of the House of St. Hilda. Count Anka handed the agreement to Marquis Menham and said in a low voice, They want Marquis Dawson. Marquis Menham stared at the parchment in his hand, and his expression changed rapidly. Finally, he said, What a clumsy trick. Count Anka was taken aback, clearly not expecting such a reaction from his father. After a while, he mumbled. After a while, he said, Father, what do you mean? It is not impossible to hand Marquis Dawson over to the House of St. Hilda. Idiot. Marquis Menham scolded. If we really sell Marquis Dawson, the dwarven army will immediately fall apart, and the Menham family will become the shame of the dwarves. When that time comes, we will lose the support of the Dawson family. Will we be able to deal with the House of St. Hilda alone? When Count Anka heard this, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead. He stuttered, then, what should we do? Marquis Menom's eyes flashed, and he said decisively. Follow me to see Marquis Dawson. Chapter 275. Deep into the night, the dwarven camp was quiet and solemn. Father, it's so late and you haven't rested yet? Marquis Dawson raised his head and saw his second son, Wales Dawson, walk in. Wales had a fair face and didn't have the nose of the dwarves. His beard was also well groomed. If it wasn't for the fact that he wasn't tall due to his race, he would be considered a handsome young man with a graceful bearing. It's so late. What are you doing here? Marquis Dawson furrowed his brows. Marquis Dawson didn't like his second son. He felt that he was too spoiled and didn't have the valiance and tenacity of the dwarves. He was only obsessed with women. Fortunately, Marquis Dawson's eldest son wasn't bad and could inherit the family business. Therefore, Marquis Dawson didn't care about his second son. Wales was a little afraid of his father. He carefully moved closer and said mysteriously, Father, I just received a shocking piece of news. What news? Marquis Dawson didn't care and buried his head in the pile of documents. Wales was a little depressed at his father's perfunctory attitude. He knew that he wasn't valued by his father, but he was unwilling to accept it. Now, he felt that his chance to turn things around was here. Father, this is news that can determine the survival of the Dawson family. Speak. Marquis Dawson was a little impatient. Wales' face flashed with a trace of resentment and he said in a low voice, Father, I heard that Marquis Menom is preparing to give you to the House of St. Hilda in exchange for their agreement to establish the dwarves. The quill in Marquis Dawson's hand finally stopped. He raised his head and looked at his second son with a burning gaze and asked in a deep voice, Where did you hear this news? Wales avoided his gaze and said hesitantly, Father, shouldn't you be worried about the betrayal of the Menom family first? Marquis Dawson glared and shouted angrily, Less nonsense. Answer my question. It's Archbishop Ajani who sent someone to inform me. How did she inform you? Why did she inform you? I. Looking at his father's increasingly ferocious gaze, Wales was so scared that he was tongue-tied and couldn't speak. Idiot. Marquis Dawson's hair and beard fluttered, making him look like an exposed lion. He kicked Wales to the ground and pounced on him. He grabbed his collar and asked fiercely, What are you doing? Are you secretly contacting people from the church? Am I right? Wales nodded while trembling. Then, his father punched him until he had a panda eye. Wales screamed exaggeratedly. His voice even attracted the guards on duty outside the tent. However, after seeing that it was a scene of a father beating his son, the guard quietly slipped out again, as if he was already used to it. Father, don't hit me. Wales cried. I really didn't betray any military secrets. There really isn't. Marquis Dawson didn't believe such nonsense. He knew his son very well. As he beat him, he scolded him. Brainless idiot. How many times have I told you that Agiani is a beautiful snake that eats people? You actually dared to secretly court her at this time. Who was she? Is this something you, a dwarf without the right to inherit a title, can hope for? She's just using you. Using you. After a long while, Marquis Dawson seemed to be tired of beating his son and stopped. Wales was paralyzed on the ground, half dead. He screamed weakly from time to time. Speak. Marquis Dawson kicked his son again. What did she say to you? Wales hugged his bruised body and suddenly felt very wronged. You didn't let me contact Agiani, so why do you want to know what she said to me? Of course, Wales only dared to criticize in his heart. She said, the Menham family has already reached an agreement with the House of St. Hilda. As long as you are handed over, the House of St. Hilda will agree to the peace talks and allow the dwarves to build a kingdom on the northern frontier. Marquis Dawson didn't seem to be worried about his situation at all. Instead, he asked, "Why did Agiani tell you this?" "Father, the situation in chilly Winter City is very tense now. Although on the surface, Vera and Colin seem to have the upper hand with the help of the Golden Lion Legion, in fact, Master Joyce also has a lot of supporters. These supporters of course don't want to see Vera solve the rebellion on the northern frontier smoothly and inherit the title of Duke. Archbishop Agiani is one of Master Joyce's supporters." Marquis Dawson looked at his son expressionlessly and asked, "So she wants to destroy the peace talks?" "Yes." Wales nodded. "She hopes to join hands with the Dawson family. This is a letter she wrote to you personally." As he spoke, he took out a letter and handed it to Marquis Dawson. Marquis Dawson didn't read the letter. Instead, he continued to look at Wales with cold eyes and asked, "Did you tell the church about our situation here?" Wales wanted to shake his head, but when he saw his father's sharp eyes, he could only stutter and say, "Yes, I did say some, but it's not any military secrets, I swear." "What did you say?" Marquis Dawson's eyes became colder and colder. "I only told them that Prince Rhy killed Mr. Dawson. That's all. There were so many witnesses. Even if I didn't say anything, the church would find out sooner or later." Marquis Dawson sighed in his heart. His son was really too stupid. He actually revealed such crucial information to the church. It was no wonder that the Menham family's emissary was obstructed when he wanted to negotiate. This was because the other party knew that the dwarves' most important bargaining chip was gone. However, it seemed that the Menham family would really betray the Dawson family in order to reach an agreement with the House of St. Hilda. While Marquis Dawson was deep in thought, Wales was still rambling on to defend himself. "Father, actually, Archbishop Agiani is a trustworthy person. The relationship between me and her isn't what you think. I only have boundless reverence for a pure and pious priest like the Archbishop. I don't dare to blaspheme her. Moreover, I can see that the Archbishop's current situation in chilly Winter Castle isn't good. Vera and Colin are using the Golden Lion Legion to suppress the resistance in Lion's Roar Castle. They are trying to push a mage's adopted daughter to the position of Dukes of the North. This is too ridiculous. Although young Master Joyce is being suppressed, you have to believe that there are many righteous northern frontier knights in the city. They won't allow." "Shut up." Marquis Dawson interrupted Wales impatiently. Wales shrunk his head and didn't dare to speak again. "You're only a chess piece in their hands. Do you really think that you're favored by Agiani? Moreover, the information provided by the other party might not be true. Even if it's true, it might be a scheme by the House of St. Hilda to sow discord. Only an idiot like you, whose brain is filled with wine and beauties, would be deceived and deceived." Wales opened his mouth. He wanted to defend the goddess in his heart, but when he saw his father's fierce eyes, he didn't dare to refute. He could only cower and hug his knees like a quail in the rain. Marquis Dawson saw his cowardly appearance and became angry. In the end, he could only sigh and wave his hand helplessly. He scolded, "Go back to sleep." "Yes." Wales grimaced as he got up from the ground and walked out carefully. Marquis Dawson's unfriendly voice came from behind him, "Remember, if I find out that you're secretly contacting the church, I'll break your legs." "Yes." Wales hastened his steps and ran away as if he was escaping. Marquis Dawson sighed desolately and shook his head. He seemed to have given up on his son. Afterwards, he picked up the letter that Wales had just handed to him, ready to see what kind of pie Archbishop Agiani had painted for the Dawson family. After opening the letter, Marquis Dawson's brows immediately furrowed. This letter. Why is it like this? Before Marquis Dawson could understand it, footsteps could be heard from outside the tent, followed by the voice of a personal guard. "Master, Marquis Menam requests an audience." "Let him in." Chapter 276. Marquis Dawson, I hope I didn't disturb your rest. As soon as he entered, Marquis Menam greeted him with a smile. Behind him was Count Anka. Marquis Dawson smiled as usual and said, "Of course not." After inviting the two of them to take a seat, Marquis Dawson ordered his guards to serve tea. He wasn't in a hurry as he quietly sipped his tea while waiting for Marquis Menham to explain his intentions. Before long, Marquis Menham said, "Marquis Dawson, I'm sure you know that Anka has just returned from chilly Winter City." Marquis Dawson glanced at Count Anka and laughed as he asked, "How was the diplomatic mission? Did the House of St. Hilda agree to the peace talks?" "The House of St. Hilda's attitude is worse than we expected." Marquis Menham sighed. Count Anka interrupted and said, "I discovered that the House of St. Hilda already knows about Mr. Xing's death. This is beyond my expectations. Moreover, this makes the peace talks extremely difficult." Marquis Menham's expression was gloomy as he said coldly, "I reckon that someone on our side secretly leaked the information to the city. Otherwise, the House of St. Hilda wouldn't have known about Mr. Xing's death so quickly." Although Marquis Dawson was cursing his idiotic son in his heart, he didn't show it on his face. He even took the initiative to change the topic. He even changed the topic and said, "So, the House of St. Hilda doesn't agree to the peace talks." Marquis Menham didn't expect that the good son of his ally had leaked the secret, so he didn't harp on this topic. He shook his head and said, "No. The House of St. Hilda is willing to negotiate. However, they raised an excessive condition." Marquis Dawson's heart skipped a beat as he thought of the information that his son had just brought back. He smiled and asked, "What condition?" Marquis Menham stared intently into Marquis Dawson's eyes and said word by word, "The House of St. Hilda wants me to hand you over." Marquis Dawson's expression changed, and his gaze became dangerous. He said in a deep voice, "Then, Marquis Menham, do you intend to accept this condition?" Marquis Menham stared intently into Marquis Dawson's eyes and didn't immediately reply. Marquis Dawson naturally stared back without giving in. The two of them were like wild beasts meeting on a narrow path as they engaged in a battle of life and death. The atmosphere in the tent became stagnant, and the air became suffocating. Count Anka instantly became restless and broke out in cold sweat. At the same time, he was extremely puzzled by his father's actions. Why did he purposely provoke Was he in the enemy's camp? Was he not afraid of being Menham's? Marquis Menham laughs. Menham, he's laughed. Menham suddenly laughed. Menham's laughs. Menham, Menham was relieved, but Menham was Menham. Marquis Dawson, do you think I will accept this condition? Marquis Menham asked with a relaxed expression. Marquis Dawson's face was full of smiles, as if he was welcoming his closest friend. Of course not. The Dawson family and the Menham family have a friendship that has lasted for 1,000 years. We are both the hope for the revival of the dwarves. Why would we kill each other? That's right. Marquis Menham clapped his hands and said loudly, that Viscount Angley thinks he can use this kind of agreement to sow discord between us. He is too naive. Ha, since you are so honest, then I won't hide it. I have just received a letter from Archbishop Ajani. The letter warned me that the Menham family is prepared to betray the Dawson family. Oh. Marquis Menham's eyes turned, and he laughed. Looks like Archbishop Ajani's relationship with you is very good. She actually helped you pass on the message. Marquis Dawson waved his hands. Sigh, I feel that this woman has bad intentions. She probably wants to use our Dawson family to do things for her. Indeed. Marquis Menham nodded. I don't even dare to get too close to that bewitching priestess for fear of being bewitched by her. You choosing to stay away from her is a very wise decision. Count Anka finally came back to his senses, and he immediately flattered with a smile. Yes, humans are too cunning. We dwarves should unite and fight against foreign enemies. Marquis Menham smiled and nodded, agreeing with his son's words. Then, he saw the letter in Marquis Dawson's hand from the corner of his eye, and he asked, "Is this the letter that Ajani sent?" "Yes. It's full of old tricks. She's too naive to think that she can trick me." Marquis Dawson magnanimously handed the letter to Marquis Menham and said, "Do you want to take a look?" "Okay." Marquis Menham did not stand on ceremony and immediately took the letter. But then he frowned and asked, "Why are there so many places that have been altered?" Marquis Dawson did not mind and said, "Oh, that's the original I received." "Ha, maybe the Archbishop was hesitant about the wording when she wrote the letter." Marquis Menham suspiciously glanced at Marquis Dawson, but he did not say anything. Instead, he carefully read the contents of the letter. After a while, he raised his head again and returned the letter to Marquis Dawson. He said, "It seems that the situation in Winter City is not stable." Marquis Dawson nodded and said, "That's right. There are definitely people in Lion's Roar Castle who do not want to see Vera inherit the title of Duke. Moreover, if Mr. Cheng's information is correct, the Oman family also has a blood feud with the Angeli family. The hidden resistance in the city cannot be underestimated. Perhaps, we can make use of it." Marquis Menham rubbed his chin and seemed to be deep in thought. After a while, he nodded and said, "This is indeed a feasible method, but how do we contact the people in the city?" Marquis Dawson coughed awkwardly and said, "I have a way to contact Archbishop Ajani, but I don't think she is trustworthy." Marquis Menham smiled and said, "Then you don't have to trust her. We and the church are just using each other. You can pretend to agree to her request first and see what she has in mind for you." Marquis Dawson seemed to be moved. After thinking for a while, he nodded and said, "Okay, I can think of a way to contact the people in the city and see if we can win over those who are dissatisfied with Vera." "Good. Thank you for your hard work." "You are welcome." Marquis Menham immediately stood up and said goodbye to Marquis Dawson. It was late at night outside the tent. There was no moon in the sky, only a little bit of starlight. Marquis Menham and his son walked quietly. When they returned to their own camp, Marquis Menham suddenly asked, "Do you think Marquis Dawson lied?" "Huh?" Earl Anka was stunned. "I don't think so." "Ha!" Marquis Menham sneered and said, "Did you see the letter? It is full of traces of alteration." Marquis Dawson said that it was originally like this, but I think that he deliberately altered the important information after receiving the letter. Earl Anka thought for a while and nodded. "That is indeed possible." Marquis Menham continued, "Also, did you notice the handwriting on the letter?" Earl Anka suddenly felt a little awkward because he did not notice the handwriting. "Don't you feel that it is familiar?" Marquis Menham asked. Earl Anka thought carefully and suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He took out the peace negotiation agreement and said in surprise, "The handwriting on the letter is the same as the handwriting on the agreement." Marquis Menham nodded and asked, "I remember you saying that this agreement was written by Viscount Angley on the spot?" "That's right. I saw him write it with my own eyes." Earl Anka finally understood. So, that letter was not written by Ajani to Marquis Dawson, but by Viscount Angley. Yes, Marquis Dawson must be lying. Marquis Menham's face was gloomy as he said, "Moreover, this is not the first lie that he has told. He is hiding other things." Earl Anka was shocked. "Do you remember his reaction when I told him that someone in the camp leaked the news of Mr. Dusk's death to Winter City?" Earl Anka thought for a while and said in shock, he did not react. Instead, he changed the topic. "Yes." Marquis Menham sneered. "Don't you think it is strange that he is not concerned about something as important as a spy in the camp?" Count Anka immediately said, "Unless he was the one who arranged for the traitor." "Yes." Marquis Menham sighed and suddenly stopped in his tracks. He turned back to look in the direction of the Dawson family's camp. "Farron Dawson, how do you expect me to trust you?" Chapter 277. The dwarven messengers arrived at Winter City. This was the third time that Count Anchor had been sent to Winter City, but this time, he was not alone. Marquis Dawson's eldest son, Count Falco Dawson, accompanied him. Count Falco was different from the unreliable Wales. As the eldest son of Marquis Dawson, he had the demeanor of an heir of the Dawson family. Furthermore, he was calm and steady, and he was highly valued by Marquis Dawson. It was obvious that the Dawson family did not want to let the Menham family negotiate with the House of St. Hilda alone. Of course, this could also be seen as the close relationship between the Menham family and the Dawson family, and it was clear that they had foiled the enemy's plan. As for what the two dwarven families were thinking, only the people involved knew. However, Colin decided to hide with Vera and let Scholar Dwayne deal with the dwarven messengers. He knew that there was no way to make any progress with the Dawson family and the Menham family present at the same time. Therefore, Scholar Dwayne and the two dwarven counts talked for the whole day. It seemed like they were arguing with each other, but in the end, they realized that there was no consensus at all. Count Anchor and Count Falco were angry, but there was nothing they could do. Scholar Dwayne had always maintained a friendly attitude, as if he was really willing to negotiate with the dwarves. However, there were some conditions that they could not agree on. During the banquet, Angeli and his wife, who had disappeared for the whole day, finally appeared. Count Anchor and Count Falco went to talk to them for a while, but they did not get any meaningful answers. Colin just said, "You can talk to Scholar Dwayne. He can completely represent the House of St. Hilda." The two dwarven counts had no choice but to give up. They were thinking about how to deal with Scholar Dwayne, who seemed friendly, but was actually very difficult to deal with. The night was getting darker, and a place in the southern part of Winter City suddenly became lively. This was originally a deserted open space, but now it was densely packed with simple and crude tents. The tents were surrounded by thorny fences, and there was a sign at the entrance that read, "Captive Camp." In the Battle of the Riverrun River, the Golden Lion Legion had defeated the Dawson clan's army, capturing roughly 15,000 prisoners. After entering chilly winter, the dwarf captives were settled here. Besides having a daily meal to prevent them from starving to death, nobody cared about them. But tonight, it seemed that someone important had come to the camp. "What's wrong? What's going on?" Holm whispered to his companion. "I don't know." After asking a few rounds, he still didn't get a definite answer. Just as he was feeling puzzled, Holmoen suddenly heard cheers coming from the front, as if they had received some great news. "What's going on? Are you going to let us go?" Holmoen scratched his head anxiously, trying to figure out what was going on, but he could not squeeze to the front. But not long after, his squad leader ran back excitedly, shouting, "The House of St. Hilda and the Dawson family have reached an agreement. There will be no more fighting. We can go home now." Really? We can go home? Happiness came too suddenly, and Holmoen could not believe it. The dwarven comrades around him had already begun to wail and howl in excitement. "Then when are we leaving? Tomorrow?" "No, they'll let us go in a while." "So fast?" Holmoen was excited, and he could not wait to leave this place that brought him bad memories. Indeed, not long after, the door of the captive camp was completely opened. The dwarves lined up neatly under the orders of the officers, and slowly walked out. Along the way, Holmoen saw General Tumu. As a rank 5 warrior, General Tumu was highly respected in the Dawson clan's army. But after being captured, he had mysteriously disappeared, and no one knew where he went. But now that he had reappeared, the captives felt much more at ease. Even though they had not had enough to eat, the dwarf captives were still spirited, and they followed the orders of the Golden Lion Legion in an orderly manner. Holmoen was in the formation, and he looked around as he walked. Half an hour later, he realized that he had arrived at the city gate. The open city gate looked eerie under the night sky, but in the eyes of the dwarf captives, it was the door to hope. After walking out of chilly Winter Castle, Holmoen was finally sure that he was saved. Outside the city gate, there was a place for weapons. Every dwarf captive that passed through there would be given a weapon. Holmoen also received a long sword. Even though he would not be able to get back his leather armor and bow, a long sword made him feel more at ease. The atmosphere in the formation became more lively, and some of the dwarf captives even sang war songs to celebrate their new life. That night, the stars were sparse, and the boundless darkness shrouded the land. In this pitch-black night, no one knew what was waiting for the dwarf captives. Holmoen also sang along with his comrades, and his footsteps were light. Even the hunger that had been plaguing him all this time had temporarily disappeared. Suddenly, the formation in front stopped. In the darkness, military orders were not transmitted smoothly, and the dwarf captives were in chaos, but they were quickly suppressed by the officers. "What's the matter?" Holmoen was anxious again. "We encountered the sentries of the Menham family," the captain comforted him. Holmoen heaved a sigh of relief, and then he became excited. This meant that they were very close to the dwarf camp. Perhaps they would be able to eat piping hot food soon. Just as Holmoen was immersed in the fantasy of food and was drooling, there was another commotion in front. "What's the matter now?" "I'll go ahead and take a look." "Stay where you are and don't run around," the captain instructed before he went ahead to investigate the situation. Holmoen could only wait patiently, but the hunger that had disappeared suddenly appeared again. It was much more intense than before, and Holmoen almost lost control of himself. As time passed, the dwarf captives did not receive any orders to advance. Meanwhile, the patience of Holmsen and the others was wearing thin in this endless wait. Anxiety and anger gradually spread among the captives. "Why aren't we allowed to return? Why aren't we allowed to return?" Suddenly, there was a commotion in front. Holmoen was on the verge of exploding when he saw the captain running back angrily. "Captain, what's going on in front? The Menham family doesn't allow us to enter their camp." "Why?" "They said that they didn't receive any news of the release of the captives. They also said that the family emissary is still in chilly Winter Castle. They didn't reach an agreement with the House of St. Hilda." "Nonsense. We're back. How can they not reach an agreement? If they don't reach an agreement, will the Golden Lion Legion release us?" While Holmoen was feeling indignant, the commotion in front escalated. Intense fighting sounds and screams could be heard. "We want to go home. We're not enemies. We want to see Marquis Dawson." It was unknown who instigated it, but the dwarf captives confronted the Menham family. Their words became more and more intense, and they were on the verge of losing control. Rumble. The ground suddenly quaked. General Tomu smashed his large hammer heavily on the ground and roared, "Who dares to stop me?" After saying that, he took the lead and rushed into the Menham family's formation. His actions were like a spark falling into hot oil, instantly igniting a raging inferno. The dwarf captives, who had become extremely anxious from the long wait and hunger, exploded. Under General Tomu's lead, they charged towards the Menham family's camp. The night was dark, but the massacre had begun. Chapter 278. What? Winter Castle released the captives. After hearing the news of the captives, Marquis Dawson wasn't happy. Instead, he was shocked. His son, Count Falco, was still in Winter Castle. Why would the Golden Lion Legion suddenly release the captives? Moreover, even if the terms were agreed upon, Count Falco and Count Anka wouldn't sign a contract with the House of St. Hilda privately. Hence, this was definitely a conspiracy. Yes, Lord Marquis. But, the captives seemed to have a conflict with the Menham family. After hearing the report, Marquis Dawson's uneasiness grew. After thinking for a while, he decisively ran towards the Menham family's camp. When he entered the Menham family's territory, he was surrounded by a group of guards. "Bring me to see Marquis Menham." "Okay, Marquis Menham wants to see you." Marquis Dawson felt a tinge of anger as he looked at the group of fully armed and cold-faced soldiers. What did Marquis Menham mean? If he didn't come forward, was he going to capture him? Marquis Dawson suppressed his anger and came to the center of the Menham family's camp. Marquis Menham, what do you mean by this? Marquis Dawson asked angrily. I want to ask you, Marquis Dawson. Why did Winter Castle suddenly release the captives of your family? I don't know, but I feel that this might be a conspiracy of the House of St. Hilda. Conspiracy? What conspiracy? Marquis Menham wasn't moved. He looked at Marquis Dawson with suspicion. Sowing discord. Marquis Dawson said in a deep voice, from the start, the House of St. Hilda has been trying to sow discord between us. Could it be that you've forgotten about the peace agreement that required you to hand me over? They know that we can't trust each other, so they used this point to try to break us apart. The captives might be part of their conspiracy. Hence, at such times, we have to trust each other and be honest with each other. If I wanted to betray you, I wouldn't have come forward to explain myself. Hearing this, Marquis Menham's expression softened. He seemed to believe Marquis Dawson's words. After a moment of silence, he asked, then what do you think we should do now? Marquis Dawson heaved a sigh of relief. Marquis Menham's attitude made him feel that there was still room for negotiation. I think that the first thing we should do is to appease the captives who have been released. We can't let the brave warriors who have shed their blood for the dwarves feel disappointed. Then, we can interrogate the captives and find out why the Golden Lion Legion released them. On the other hand, we need to contact Anka and Falco as soon as possible. While Marquis Dawson was actively cooperating with Marquis Menham in an attempt to eliminate the negative impact of the sudden release of the captives, the situation was rapidly deteriorating in an unpredictable direction. The news of the captives being released quickly spread throughout the Dawson clan's camp. Unlike the Menham clan's resistance and suspicion, the Dawson clan's people were very willing to accept these captives. After all, those captives were their comrades and even their relatives. But when the news of the conflict between the captives and the Menham clan's army spread, the Dawson clan's officers were immediately filled with suspicion and anger. They all gathered outside Marquis Dawson's tent and wanted to ask what had happened. Why did the Menham clan attack their captives? But at this moment, Marquis Dawson had gone to meet Marquis Menham and wasn't in the camp. Without a leader, the Dawson clan's officers started arguing. Some wanted to rescue the captives, some wanted to clarify the situation, and some wanted to wait for Marquis Dawson's return before discussing. In short, the Dawson clan's camp was in a mess. At this moment, Wales was pushed out by the officers who were arguing endlessly. As the second son of Marquis Dawson, he didn't have much prestige in the army. But now, Marquis Dawson's whereabouts were unknown. Marquis Dawson's eldest son, Count Falco, had yet to return from chilly Winter City. Therefore, Wales became the most qualified person to lead the Dawson clan's army. Although everyone knew that Wales wasn't reliable, a mediocre leader was better than no leader at all. If this continued, the captives who had just been released would probably all be killed. Wales was panicking. But facing the burning gazes of the officers, he couldn't shrink back. He had to make a decision. The huge pressure made Wales shiver uncontrollably. He was sweating profusely and his mouth was dry. He forced himself to calm down, but he didn't dare to take responsibility. He just said, I think, we have to find father first. Marquis Dawson went to the Menham clan. We've already sent people to find him, but there's no response. An officer shouted. Wales was even more panicked. But then, a thought flashed through his mind and he blurted out. Not good. Marquis Menham wants to detain father and hand him over to the House of St. Hilda in exchange for their forgiveness. What? This sentence caused the Dawson clan officers to explode. It was the first time they heard such news. Then, the scene became even more chaotic. But more and more people began to request for the army to be dispatched to retrieve Marquis Dawson and the released captives. Wales felt that he had understood the whole story. The reason why his father hadn't returned for so long was because he had been detained. At this moment, the glory of the Dawson clan made him change his cowardly personality. He stood up and shouted loudly, asking everyone to go rescue Marquis Dawson. Amidst the chaos and anxiety, the Dawson clan finally had a unified voice. Although this voice might not lead them to a bright future, at this moment, the confused people needed a direction. No matter where it led them, it was better than going around in circles in the dark. Thus, a loud bugle sounded in the Dawson clan camp. That was the signal to attack. Marquis Dawson, who heard the sound, froze on the spot. He was dumbfounded. He was about to convince Marquis Menham to take in the captives and stabilize the situation. But now, with the sound of the bugle, the entire dwarven camp was boiling. Marquis Menham's gaze became as sharp as a viper's. "Fran Dawson. What are you doing? This is a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding." Marquis Dawson was sweating profusely as he explained, "Marquis Menham, those idiots must have thought that something happened to me after I left for so long. They were impulsive and did something stupid. But I hope you understand that I have no intention of going against you. Our two families can't go against each other. This will only benefit the House of St. Hilda. Please let me go. I'll pacify those troublemakers." "Let you go?" Marquis Menham sneered, "You've been playing tricks on me time and time again. Do you think I'm a fool?" Marquis Dawson was sweating profusely. His tone had a hint of pleading. "Marquis Menham, if you detain me here, it will only make the misunderstanding bigger and the conflict more serious." "Misunderstanding?" Marquis Menham's gaze was cold. "When you lied to me last night, there was no trust between us. Now, Austere Castle released the captives of the Dawson family for no reason, and these captives attacked my army. Hee, do you think you can continue to deceive me?" Marquis Dawson was taken aback and asked, "How did I lie to you last night?" Marquis Menham had lost his patience with Marquis Dawson. He smiled coldly and said to his subordinates, "Treat Marquis Dawson well. Treat Marquis Dawson well. Without my orders, no one is allowed to see him." "Yes." A group of guards immediately surrounded Marquis Dawson. "Marquis Menham, Marquis Menham. Listen to my explanation. This is a plot by the House of St. Hilda. Don't fall for it." Marquis Dawson was still shouting, but Marquis Menham had already left without looking back. Chapter 279. The soft light from the crystal chandelier illuminated the main hall of the church. Falco stepped on the thick, light yellow wool carpet and slowly walked into the church. It was already late at night, and there was only an old priest on night duty in the church. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for Archbishop Ajani." The old priest frowned and said, "Sorry, it's too late today. The Archbishop is already resting. You can come tomorrow." "Count Falco." At this moment, the emeritus bishop suddenly appeared in the church and beckoned to Falco. "Please follow me." Falco smiled apologetically at the old priest and followed the emeritus bishop to the back of the church. During this diplomatic trip to Winter City, his father, Marquis Dawson, had asked him to find a way to meet Archbishop Ajani. Even though Wales, that unreliable fellow, often did stupid things, he still managed to contact the church leader of the northern frontier. Now that the peace talks with the House of St. Hilda had reached a stalemate, the Dawson family was prepared to try the church. Perhaps there would be some unexpected surprises. Knock, knock, knock. The emeritus bishop lightly knocked on the door, and a languid voice came from inside, "Come in. Count Falco, please." The emeritus bishop smiled and gestured with his hand. "Thank you, Your Eminence." Falco smiled at the emeritus bishop and pushed the door open. This room was probably the archbishop's private parlor. Even though the decorations were not luxurious, they were rather exquisite. Falco had just entered when he saw Archbishop Ajani's back. She was standing quietly in front of the window, overlooking the dark night sky. Perhaps because it was not a public occasion, the archbishop did not wear a priest's robe tonight. Instead, she wore a purple dress. The dark color of the dress formed a strong contrast with her white skin, accentuating her otherworldly temperament. She was like a descending angel. On the windowsill beside Ajani, there was a crystal vase half filled with water. There was a bunch of purple irises in the water, matching the color of Ajani's dress. The night breeze outside the window blew the petals of the irises, spreading an intoxicating fragrance into the room. "Good evening, Count Falco." Ajani did not turn around. She only lowered her head and fiddled with the petals of the iris flower. Just the sight of his back was enough to make Falco's heart race and his mouth dry up. He finally understood why his younger brother was so obsessed with this woman. "Good evening, Your Excellency. I hope I didn't disturb your rest." Ajani turned to the side and pointed at a small round table in the room. She said softly, "Don't be so nervous. Sit down and drink something." Falco thanked him and sat down at the table. He picked up his teacup and took a sip. Falco's spirit was slightly shaken by the bitter taste. He saw Akane staring out of the window in a daze and spoke again. "Your Excellency, I've come to find you this time mainly to thank you on behalf of my father for the news you delivered last time. Even though Marquis Maynam wasn't tricked by the House of St. Hilda, the Dawson family still thanks you for your kind reminder." "Really? The relationship between the Menham clan and the Dawson clan really surprises me." Because Ajani's back was facing Falco, he couldn't see her expression. He nodded with a smile. "Don't worry, we dwarves have been fighting for this common goal for 1,000 years. It's not something that can be easily sowed discord between us." At this moment, a faint clamor came from outside the window. Ajani's expression became very interesting. Even though Falco was curious about the clamor, he couldn't go to the window to take a look. That would be too impolite. He could only suppress his curiosity and continue. "Your Excellency, the negotiations with the House of St. Hilda have reached a stalemate. So I was wondering if you could exert some pressure on the House of St. Hilda to facilitate this negotiation. In return, the Dawson family is willing to support your actions on the northern frontier, including, the issue of the inheritance of the Dukes of the North." Hearing this, Ajani finally turned around. She had a faint smile on her delicate oval face, and her limpid eyes were fixated on Count Falco. Her gaze was filled with charm. Falco only felt a nameless flame rising in his lower abdomen, making his whole body hot and dry. He was almost unable to control himself. "Count Falco, what do you think my position on the issue of the inheritance of the Dukes of the North is?" Ajani's languid and slightly hoarse voice was like a swan feather, constantly stirring Falco's restless heart. "I." Falco's breathing was heavy, his face flushed. His eyes were fixed on Ajani, as if he wanted to use his gaze to completely melt her. "You what?" With a slight twist of her right wrist, a purple whip flew out and lashed Count Falco's shoulder with a swoosh. "Ah!" Falco screamed miserably. He didn't understand why Ajani suddenly turned hostile, but what was more shocking was that he, a rank 4 warrior, couldn't evade the attack of a priest. One had to know that a priest was a support class, and wasn't proficient in combat. Moreover, that whip wasn't fast. If it was under normal circumstances, Falco felt that he could completely evade it. But now, he felt as if his legs were filled with lead. His whole body felt like it was on fire, and his brain was filled with all kinds of chaotic thoughts. He couldn't keep calm. "Count Falco, what are you trying to say?" The smile on Ajani's face grew sweeter and sweeter. Her voice was as gentle as a wife greeting her husband who had just returned home. But at the same time, the whip in her hand lashed out mercilessly and Count Falco fell to the ground. There was a problem with the tea. Falco finally reacted, but his consciousness was already on the verge of collapse. In his eyes, Ajani had completely turned from an angel into a demon, although he didn't know why she did this. The noise outside the window grew louder and louder. At the same time, Bursts of fire gradually lit up, dispelling the darkness that enveloped the land. Ajani took one last look at the commotion outside the city, put away her whip, and strolled towards the door. At the door, she placed one hand on the door handle, but turned her head to look at Falco, who was struggling on the ground, as if she was expecting something. A moment later, Count Falco finally raised his head and let out an unusual roar. His eyes had already turned scarlet, as if he had completely lost his mind. When he saw Ajani at the door, he immediately jumped up from the ground and pounced. Ajani's lips curled into a smug sneer. She immediately tore open the sleeves of her dress, revealing her white and tender arms. At the same time, she opened the door and rushed out, wailing mournfully. Count Falco! What are you doing? Count Falco, Count Falco! Count Anka knocked on the door for a long time, but there was no response. An alarmed patrolling guard walked over and said, Count Falco went out. Do you know where he went? Sorry, I don't know either. Count Anka was anxious, and he did not know what to do. He was awakened by the noise outside the city. Winter City was built on a mountain, and the Lion's Roar Fortress was at the peak of the mountain. Looking down, he could see the fire in the dwarf camp outside the city. Count Anka did not know what was going on, but he guessed that it was probably not something good. Seeing that Count Falco was not around, Count Anka walked to the main fortress alone. Are Miss Vera and Viscount Angli resting? The guard glanced at Count Anka and motioned for him to enter. Count Anka quickly pushed open the heavy door, and the first thing he saw was Colin and Vera in the hall. Count Anka, can't you sleep either? Colin did not seem surprised by Count Anka's arrival. He turned around and greeted him with a smile. However, Count Anka's heart sank because he saw Colin putting on his armor with Vera's help. Viscount Angli, what are you going to do? Count Anka asked in a hoarse voice. Colin patted the blade of judgment at his waist and smiled. There are some people outside the city who are not obedient. It is already so late, and they are still making a ruckus. I have to teach them a lesson. Count Anka's forehead was covered in cold sweat, and he said with difficulty, Lord Viscounts, what is going on outside? Why don't you come with me and take a look? Then you'll know. Colin had already put on his armor, and he kissed Vera's forehead gently before inviting Count Anka. However, Count Anka had a bad premonition, and he said anxiously, Lord Viscounts, are you going to start a war? Colin's face turned cold, and he said firmly, the war has already begun the moment you besieged the city. Count Anka wanted to explain, but Colin had already walked out. Miss Vera. Is the House of St. Hilda really going to fight the dwarves to the death? Count Anka did not give up and he shouted at Vera. However, Vera ignored him and held Colin's arm as they walked out together. Count Anka was stunned for a long time, and his expression changed rapidly. Finally, he gritted his teeth and followed after them. Chapter 280. Chi. Holmoan pulled his longsword out of the enemy's chest, and hot blood splattered all over his face. Hoo! He panted heavily, and the cramps in his stomach caused by hunger made him unable to straighten his back. It was unknown if it was blood or sweat, but Holmoan's vision was blurred, and he couldn't see the situation in front of him. This battle came too suddenly and too inexplicably. Holmoan thought that he could escape the fate of being a captive, but what awaited him wasn't an ally's acceptance, but an attack. He couldn't figure out why the Menham family wanted to kill them. But he was a nameless soldier who didn't understand the situation and was powerless to change the situation. When the enemy surged forward like a flood, he had no choice but to draw his longsword and resist. Holmoan didn't have much combat power due to malnutrition during his captivity. His hands were as heavy as lead, and he couldn't lift them. Under the cover of the night, Holmoan didn't know the situation on the battlefield. He only knew that his comrades were falling, and even their leader was killed. If General Tumu wasn't at the front line like a god of war, the released dwarven captives would have collapsed. But now, they were on the verge of collapse. At this moment, Holmoen heard a faint sound behind him. He turned his head and saw the gates of chilly winter open again. A fire dragon made up of numerous torches emerged from the gates. The Golden Lion Legion was here. Holmoen's heart twitched. He had an ominous premonition that this would be an unforgettable night for the dwarves. The Golden Lion Legion wasn't in a hurry to join the battle. Instead, they leaned against the city walls and formed an orderly formation. It was as though they were waiting for the dwarves to emerge victorious. The commotion made the dwarves realize that something was amiss. The Menham family army immediately sounded the bugle call for retreat. But at this moment, the Dawson clan's army continued to chase after them, because they wanted to rescue Marquis Dawson. The dwarven prisoners released from chilly winter collapsed to the ground as though they were deflated. They were unable to move. In this battle, they were the ones who suffered the heaviest casualties. Of the more than 15,000 captives, less than half of the original number were still breathing. It was only after the Menham family's army had retreated that the Golden Lion Legion slowly approached. "Put down your weapons, kneel and surrender. Put down your weapons, kneel and surrender." Upon hearing such a voice, Holmsen could no longer muster up any thoughts of resistance. He immediately threw away the long saber in his hand and knelt on the ground obediently. At the same time, he sighed. What the hell? How did he become a captive right after being released? The faint light of dawn gradually tore apart the darkness and gave light to the earth once again. The armies of the Dawson family and the Menham family temporarily stopped fighting and entered a tense standoff. In fact, Marquis Menam regretted his decision the moment he saw the Golden Lion Legion leave the city. Although he didn't want to admit it, he understood that he had been fooled. Thus, he led his army away from Cold Winter City and slowly retreated. At the same time, he sent an envoy to the Dawson family's army to request for reconciliation. At this moment, the commander of the Dawson clan's army, Wales Dawson, immediately made a request. The only possibility for reconciliation was for the Menham clan to immediately release Marquis Dawson and compensate the Dawson clan for their losses. However, at this moment, Marquis Menam had other thoughts. He was clear that after a night of chaotic battle, the relationship between the Dawson family and the Menham family was completely broken. Even if he followed Wales' request to release Marquis Dawson and compensate the Dawson clan for their losses, the relationship between the two families couldn't be restored. The seed of distrust had been deeply planted, and it would be extremely difficult to eliminate it. Once the two dwarven families couldn't work together, they wouldn't be able to gain the upper hand against the House of St. Hilda. After a night of chaotic battle, the exhausted dwarven allied army might not be a match for the Golden Lion Legion. At this moment, Marquis Menam was thinking of how to resolve the situation. The peace terms proposed by the House of St. Hilda weren't unacceptable to him. Marquis Dawson seemed to have noticed something from Marquis Menam's gloomy expression. He immediately said, Marquis Menam immediately said, "If you want to hand me over in exchange for the forgiveness of the House of St. Hilda, you're courting death." Marquis Menam's heart skipped a beat, and he asked in a deep voice, "Why?" Marquis Dawson sneered, "You still don't understand. The House of St. Hilda didn't intend to negotiate with us from the start. They can't tolerate the dwarves establishing an independent nation on the northern frontier. Therefore, they've been trying to sow discord between us, one after another. If you hand me over, and even work with the Golden Lion Legion to defeat the Dawson family, do you think the House of St. Hilda will let the Menham family off? No. They'll definitely think of a way to deal with the Menham family. When the time comes, without the help of the Dawson family, do you think the Menham family can face the House of St. Hilda alone?" Marquis Menam immediately fell into silence. Marquis Dawson saw this and immediately struck while the iron was hot. Therefore, the Dawson family and the Menham family are bound together for good or ill. Only if the two families work together can the dwarves gain a foothold on the northern frontier. But Marquis Menam didn't immediately agree. Instead, he frowned and asked, Marquis Dawson, do you think I can still trust you after last night's incident? Marquis Dawson took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, I can promise that if you let me go, I'll immediately withdraw my army and won't allow them to attack you. Moreover, I can send Falco to your side. Marquis Menam's gaze froze, and he was slightly moved. He knew that Count Falco was Marquis Dawson's designated successor. This action was more binding than a simple verbal promise. But then he frowned again. Isn't Count Falco in chilly Winter City? He should be detained by the House of St. Hilda. How are you going to hand him over to me? Marquis Dawson's eyes rolled as he immediately said, then Wales will do. If you let me go, I'll hand Wales over to you as a hostage. Marquis Menam laughed and shook his head as he said, do you think I'm stupid? You don't care about Wales at all. Even if I kill him, you won't feel any heartache. Marquis Dawson said helplessly, then what do you want? Marquis Menam was deep in thought. But at this moment, the Golden Lion Legion had caught up and was pointing their weapons at the Menhem family. On the other side, the Oman family's army had also arrived. Their target was the Dawson family's army, but the Oman family's army was only in formation and didn't have any intention of attacking. It was as though they were guarding against the Dawson family and didn't want them to act rashly. The Golden Lion Legion had already sounded the bugle horn to attack. Seeing this, Marquis Menam immediately ordered his army to prepare for battle. At the same time, he looked coldly at Marquis Dawson and mocked him. You said that you didn't have any secret contact with the House of St. Hilda. Then why did the Golden Lion Legion attack my army and not yours? Marquis Dawson sighed and seemed disheartened as he said, if you're bewitched by the House of St. Hilda, then there's no need for us to continue working together. The dream of the dwarves establishing a nation, perhaps it's just like what Marquis Garcia said. It's just a joke. Marquis Dawson closed his eyes in shame, as though he wasn't willing to speak anymore. Marquis Menam's expression was uncertain, but with the enemy in front of him, he didn't have much time to think. He could only cast aside all distracting thoughts and focus on the Golden Lion Legion's attack. Soon, the vanguards of the two armies clashed. The sounds of battle instantly filled the wilderness. Chapter 281. Boom. The two armies that were surging forward finally collided with each other unavoidably. Fierce sounds of metal clashing and tragic howls intertwined in an instant. Bright flowers of blood bloomed with a loud bang, and many soldiers instantly howled and fell to the ground. In a head-on collision without any tricks, strength determined everything. The Golden Lion Legion was still maintaining a strict square charging formation. The first row of infantrymen raised their sturdy giant shields and connected them to form a cold shield wall, firmly blocking the surging dwarves outside the shield wall. On the other hand, the second and third rows of infantrymen used the spears in their hands to continuously thrust through the gaps between the shields, stabbing down the dwarves outside the shield wall row by row. Bang. A dwarf soldier was pushed forward by the crowd and slammed into the giant shield of the Golden Lion Legion. The sharp spikes on the surface of the shield instantly left a dozen huge bloody holes in his body. The dwarf soldier held the shield with both hands and roared as he struggled to pull his body out of the shield. However, when he lowered his head, he saw more than 10 streams of blood spurting out from his body. The fear of death instantly enveloped him, and shrill screams continuously came from his mouth. Bang. Another dwarf soldier smashed the giant shield with his hammer, making a deafening sound. However, it did not break the giant shield, only leaving a small, harmless dent on it. Whoosh whoosh. Two sharp spears pierced through the gaps on both sides of the shield. With a flash of cold light, the spears pierced into the dwarf soldier's lower abdomen and came out from his back. Dark red blood slowly dripped down along the blade of the spears. Behind him, a fearless dwarf soldier stepped on his companion's shoulder and leaped onto the giant shield. He raised the sharp sword in his hand high and laughed wildly as he slashed at the human soldier hiding behind the giant shield. However, before the steel saber in his hand could strike down, a cold spear had already pierced out like a poisonous snake. *TCH. The sharp edge of the spear pierced through the chest of the dwarf soldier, nailing him firmly in the air. A shrill howl came from the dwarf's mouth, and as his blood spurted out, the vitality of his youth flowed out of his body like a tide. "Get out of my way!" A dwarf officer rushed to the front of the giant shield and smashed the long-handled giant hammer in his hand down. Boom. Amidst the violent impact, a sturdy steel shield was instantly torn apart, unable to block the might of the dwarf's hammer. The human soldier hiding behind the shield was shocked as if he had been struck by lightning. Blood flowed out of his orifices and he fell to the ground, his body twitching. However, almost as soon as this person fell to the ground, another human soldier carrying a giant shield came up to fill the gap that the dwarf had just smashed open, so that the formation of the vanguard was still intact. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. 3 sharp spears stabbed out from 3 different angles at the same time, the blades flashing with cold light aimed at the dwarf officer. Clang clang. The dwarf officer tried his best to block and knocked away 2 spears, but he could no longer stop the last spear from piercing his right arm. In the midst of the splashing blood, the dwarf officer roared and smashed the handle of the spear that had pierced through his arm with his hammer. However, another spear pierced through the gap of the shield wall and went straight for his head. The dwarf officer felt a chill in his heart. He could only helplessly take a few steps back and hide in the rear of the army. But at this moment, the formation of the dwarf army was already showing signs of collapsing. The dwarves were no match for the Golden Lion Legion, whether it was the quality of their soldiers or their training equipment. Needless to say, they had just experienced a chaotic battle last night and were already exhausted. How could they be a match for the Golden Lion Legion? Under the cold-blooded and orderly assassination of the Golden Lion Army, the dwarf vanguard fell row by row, and their formation gradually fell apart. But the formation of the Golden Lion Army was still stable. The foot soldiers at the front raised their shields and began to slowly advance. The spears behind the shields continued to shoot out like venomous snakes, continuing to devour the lives of the dwarf soldiers. At the rear of the Golden Lion Army, Count Anka's face was pale, and cold sweat broke out all over his body. "Viscount Angli, the Menham family is willing to negotiate. Please withdraw your troops immediately." Colin looked at the situation in front of him and said without turning his head, "Count Anka, you can decide when the war begins, but when it ends is not up to you." Count Anka's mouth was full of bitterness. He could only lower his stance and say, "Viscount Angli, please state your conditions." "As long as the Menham family can do it, I will agree." Colin glanced at him and said with a smile, "I want you to scram from the northern frontier." "Can I do that?" The corners of Count Anka's eyes twitched. He forced a smile and said, "Viscount Angli, the Menham family has already reached an agreement with many lords of the northern frontier to exchange territories." "Aren't you forcing us to go back on these agreements?" Colin shrugged and shook his head. "Then there's nothing to talk about. Let's continue fighting. Let me see if the Menham family has the right to establish a foothold on the northern frontier." "Viscount Angli, why do you have to do this? There will always be casualties when 2 armies fight. Can you bear to see the Golden Lion Army suffer heavy losses?" "Suffer heavy losses?" Colin smiled disdainfully. "Does the Menham family have the ability to do so?" Count Anka was so agitated that his face turned red. His tone became impolite. "Viscount Angli, have you not heard of the Menham family's heavy armored infantry?" "I have. Moreover, I would like to see it with my own eyes." Colin had a nonchalant look on his face, but then his eyes focused. He smiled and pointed in the direction of the battlefield. "Ha, the opportunity is here." Count Anka hurriedly turned to look in front of him. He saw a flood of red steel emerging from the Menham family's formation. It was as if lava was gushing out, surging toward the front lines of the battlefield. That was the 8,000 heavy armored infantry that the Menhem family was most proud of. Count Anka took a deep breath. He knew that his father had already thrown all of his family's resources into the battlefield. It looked like he was prepared to fight to the death. Thus, he stopped trying to persuade him. He was prepared to let Colin experience the Menhem family's strength and make him suffer a little. This way, perhaps the House of St. Hilda would be willing to return to the negotiation table. It had to be said that the heavy-armored dwarven infantry army's battle prowess was indeed shocking. The moment they joined the battle, the situation on the battlefield suddenly changed. The Golden Lion army's giant shield and spear formation seemed to have collided with a towering mountain. Their forward momentum was immediately suppressed. The sharp spears were unable to pose a threat to the heavy-armored infantry. They could only let them shout in unison and wave their warhammers as they pushed back. Count Anka was excited, and a smug smile appeared on his face. However, when he turned to look at Colin, he did not find any trace of panic on his face. Count Anka thought that Colin was only pretending to be calm and felt disdain in his heart. He turned his gaze back to the battlefield, prepared to persuade him when the Golden Lion army's formation completely crumbled. At that time, Colin's attitude would definitely not be as unyielding as before. However, after observing for a while, Count Anka realized to his surprise that even though the Golden Lion army's formation was continuously retreating, it was still orderly and showed no signs of collapsing. As the heavy-armored dwarven infantry continued to press forward, the distance between them and the army behind them had unknowingly increased. At this moment, a distant bugle call suddenly sounded from behind the dwarven army. Following that, faint shouts could be heard. At this moment, the dwarves still did not know what was happening, but the shouts were getting closer and closer. At the same time, the dense sound of horse hooves could be heard. It was as if countless giants were beating on the ground, causing the entire field to tremble. Count Anka's heart skipped a beat. Looking into the distance, he saw a thin black line appear on the field behind the Menhem family. This black line grew larger and wider until it finally formed a black sea that spread toward the battlefield. In this black sea, the Black Lion flag and the Angeli family's roaring white bear flag fluttered in the wind. They surged forward like giant waves in a tropical storm, or like a flood that had broken through a dam. Everywhere they went, everything was drowned by this black flood. It was a chilling sight. Black cavalry. Count Anka's voice changed. He immediately realized that this was a trap set up by Colin. At that moment, the Menhem family's most elite heavy-armored infantry regiment was already entangled with the Golden Lion Legion. They were completely separated from the main army at the rear. The Shadow Guards seized this perfect opportunity and suddenly charged out from the rear. They were like dragons emerging from the water as they attacked the core of the Menhem family's formation. It's over. Even though the Black Cavalry had yet to arrive, Count Anka could already foresee what would happen next. And this foresight made him feel as if he had fallen into an icy cavern. Thus, he no longer dared to hesitate. He immediately turned to Colin and begged for mercy. Viscount Angley. We admit defeat. As long as you are willing to stop the war, the Menhem family will immediately withdraw from the northern frontier. The matter of the dwarves establishing a kingdom will never be mentioned again. Colin chuckled and said coldly, I've already told you this before. I've already said that you can decide when this war will begin, but when it will end, you'll have to ask for my opinion. Then what is your opinion? Colin did not reply. Instead, a bloodthirsty smile appeared on his face. Boom! In an instant, the Black Cavalry had already charged into the rear of the Menhem family's army like a violent wave. Blood splattered everywhere, and dismembered corpses flew everywhere. Chapter 282. Wales and the officers of the Dawson family could only watch helplessly as the Black Cavalry broke through the Menhem family's central army formation like wolves and tigers. They couldn't help but feel a sense of sympathy for the loss of the rabbit. The Menhem family was finished. That was the only thing they could agree on. Even though the Golden Lion Legion was actually at a disadvantage on the battlefield and was forced to retreat step by the heavy infantry regiment, when the Black Cavalry suddenly attacked from the rear and cut down the commander's flag, the Menhem family's elite vanguard inevitably fell into chaos. Even if the vanguard wanted to retreat, it would be too late. Moreover, the Golden Lion Legion wouldn't let them go so easily. Moreover, once the Central Army and Rear Army collapsed, the Menhem family's army would become a headless snake. Without a unified command, they could only fight on their own and would be defeated one by one. "Young master, should we go and support them?" a Dawson family officer asked Wales. Wales resisted the urge to curse and glared fiercely at the person who asked the question, but didn't answer. "Support my ass." The Dawson family had just fought a life-and-death battle with the Menhem family. How could they go and support them now? Moreover, the Oman family was eyeing them covetously. Wales was almost certain that if they dared to act rashly, the Oman family would definitely launch a large-scale attack. Seeing the Menhem family's miserable state, Wales didn't want the Dawson family to follow in their footsteps. "Let's just retreat," Wales suggested hesitantly. But such a shameful suggestion made the officers of the Dawson family lower their heads. Everyone's reaction made Wales realize that he had said something stupid. What was the use of retreating now? Let's not talk about whether they could retreat or not. Even if they did, what was the use? Once the House of St. Hilda pacified the chaos at the northern frontier, wouldn't they have time to deal with the Dawson family? At this moment, the officers were looking forward to Marquis Dawson's safe return. Even if Marquis Dawson wasn't there, Count Falco was. It was better than letting this random Wales come up with ideas. "I think it's better to ask for peace from the House of St. Hilda," an officer suggested in a muffled voice. Yes. We should continue the peace talks, Wales seemed to be grabbing onto a life-saving straw as he kept shouting. But before Wales could send out an emissary to seek peace, an emissary from Coldwinter City arrived at the Dawson clan's camp. However, this messenger was wearing a priest's robe. While the officers were bewildered, Wales was overjoyed. He grasped the priest's hand and asked urgently, "What's the matter? Did the Archbishop send you here?" The priest smiled and nodded, then pulled his hand out without a trace. "Praise the God of light." Wales was so emotional that he sounded like he was about to cry. "I knew the Archbishop wouldn't give up on her most devout believer. Your Excellency Wales, the Archbishop is willing to help the Dawson family reach a settlement with the House of St. Hilda. However, she needs you to show some sincerity. Otherwise, she won't be able to speak on your behalf." "What sincerity?" "As long as our Dawson clan is able to accomplish it, please give us your orders. It's actually very simple." The priest chuckled and said, "The Menhem family brazenly invaded the northern frontier and has been listed as an enemy that must be killed by the House of St. Hilda. If you can lead an army to assist in attacking the Menhem family, then the House of St. Hilda will consider forgiving the Dawson family for their previous betrayal." Wales was a little hesitant. It wasn't that he didn't want to attack the Menhem family. After all, the two families had already shed all pretense of cordiality and had even fought last night. However, Marquis Dawson was still in their hands. Wales was worried that his attack would cause the Menhem family to act in desperation and kill his father. After voicing his doubts, the priest smiled mysteriously and moved closer to Wales, whispering to him, "Don't worry." He whispered, "Your Excellency Wales, do you want to inherit the Dawson family's title?" Wales' gaze froze and his heart skipped a few beats. He asked evasively, "What do you mean?" "His Excellency the Archbishop told me to tell you that he can help you get rid of Count Falco. As for your father, Marquis Dawson." Forgive me for speaking bluntly, but the House of St. Hilda will definitely not let him off for his previous betrayal of Marquis Garcia. Therefore, even if he can survive from the Menhem family, he will definitely not be able to escape the judgment of the House of St. Hilda. Then, do you really want the Dawson family to be implicated along with him?" Whale's heart was thumping. He really wanted to ask what happened to his brother, Count Falco, but he didn't dare to do so when the words reached his mouth. After pondering for a long time, he finally raised his head again. His eyes were now filled with ambition. "All right, I'm willing to listen to the Archbishop's suggestion. I also hope that the Archbishop can help the Dawson family fight for a decent ending." The mage chuckled and nodded, "Of course. The Archbishop will never give up on his devout believers." After receiving the Archbishop's promise, Wales immediately felt that he had a backer. His dispirited state was swept away as he immediately reorganized his army and began to attack the Menham family's left flank. At this moment, the Menham family's army was already on the verge of collapse. The Golden Lion Legion had already pressed forward from the front, while the Black Cavalry attacked from the back. Galloping unhindered, they continuously cut up the Menham family's army, making it impossible for them to regroup. The addition of the Dawson family was the last straw that broke the camel's back. More and more Menham family soldiers threw away their weapons in the face of cruel reality and chose to surrender. Of course, the Menham family didn't lack brave warriors who didn't fear death. But their stubborn resistance was like moths to a flame in the face of such a magnificent situation. Apart from adding a bit of heroism and sorrow, there was no other use. The moment Marquis Menham saw the appearance of the Black Cavalry, he already knew that this battle boded ill rather than well. When the Dawson family's army turned against him, he fell into complete despair. The furious Marquis Menham immediately drew his sword from his waist and turned around to stab at Marquis Dawson. Marquis Dawson faced the incoming sword and didn't dodge. Instead, a look of relief appeared on his face. Chi. The long sword pierced through his chest. Marquis Dawson looked at his dwarven compatriot in front of him, his lips curling into a sneer as he hissed, "I'll be waiting for you in heaven." This attitude caused the already furious Marquis Menham to fall into madness. He roared as he chopped off Marquis Dawson's head and chopped his corpse into 7 or 8 pieces before stopping. Afterwards, Marquis Menham raised the bloody head and ordered, "White flag. Raise the white flag and surrender." The afternoon sun was very strong, shining on the blood-stained ground. Flocks of vultures circled in the air, ready to dive down and feast at any time. "Father." When Marquis Menham was escorted in front of Colin, Count Ankh immediately rushed forward. Marquis Menham's eyes were empty and he ignored his son who ran over. He just knelt in front of Vera and Colin and placed Marquis Dawson's head in front of him. After that, he didn't say a word as he waited quietly for his sentence. Vera turned around and looked at Colin. Obviously, she didn't know how to deal with Marquis Menham. Colin didn't hold back either. He immediately stepped forward and announced his sentence. "Marquis Menham, you and your family are not welcome at the northern frontier. Therefore, after this battle, please return to the Flaming Flame territory immediately. Unless you have the permission of the House of St. Hilda, you are not allowed to set foot on the northern frontier again. In order to compensate for the harm your family has caused to the people of the northern frontier, your family's army will remain in the northern frontier as slaves. They will work for the northern frontier until they die. At the same time, the Menham family will have to pay the House of St. Hilda a total of 8 million gold coins as war reparations. The reparations will be paid off over 5 years. Are you willing to accept these conditions?" Marquis Menham's heart was bleeding, but he knew that there was no room for negotiation. If this had happened before the battle, he might have been able to ask for the entire army to retreat from the northern frontier. However, now, he would be lucky if he could keep the Menham family alive. Of course, he also knew that Colin didn't kill him because he wanted to save the face of the royal family. The Menham family had lost all of their army and they were burdened with heavy debts. Naturally, they wouldn't be able to threaten the House of St. Hilda anymore. As time passed, they would slowly sink and never regain their former glory. The dream of the dwarves establishing their own country would also become an unattainable dream. Marquis Menham couldn't help but feel sad when he thought of this. I am willing to accept. At this time, Colin finally revealed a satisfied smile. Not far away, Wales Dawson was accompanied by a priest as he walked towards Colin. When Wales saw his father's head, his eyes narrowed slightly, but the expression on his face was very strange. There was sadness and fear on his face, but there was also joy and joy. Dear Miss Vera, dear Viscount Angley. Your most loyal servant, the Dawson family, begs for your forgiveness. Looking at Wales, who was crawling on the ground, and then looking at the priest beside him, Colin chuckled as if he had understood something. Colin rubbed his chin as he smiled at Wales. Wales, your attitude of begging for forgiveness doesn't seem to be sincere enough. Hearing that, Wales immediately understood and nodded. He then crawled to Vera on all fours and kissed her toes while saying loudly, I'm sorry, Vera. Dear Miss Vera, the Dawson family begs for your forgiveness. Colin looked at the second son of the Dawson family, who had no dignity at all, and smiled disdainfully. He then nodded at Vera. Vera nodded coldly and accepted the other party's apology. Wales was relieved, and he continued to praise the kindness of the House of St. Hilda loudly. His posture was so ugly that it was simply unbearable to look at. Colin smiled as he looked at the clown's performance. He began to think about how to deal with the Dawson family. Of course, he wouldn't let them go so easily. However, looking at Wales' appearance, it seemed like the Dawson family wouldn't be able to cause any trouble. At this point, the rebellion on the northern frontier had finally come to an end. Chapter 283. Merciful God of Light, we are here today to offer our prayers to the Duke of St. Hilda. He has finished his journey in this world and has finally returned to the embrace of our Lord. Archbishop Ajani's pious voice echoed in the quiet and solemn tomb. The morning sun shone through the glass dome, sprinkling colorful light in the tomb. This was one of the most sacred places in the Lion's Roar Castle, where the remains of the Duke of St. Hilda were buried. Today, a new member would be welcomed here. In fact, the funeral of the Duke of St. Hilda was held in a hurry. The northern frontier had just calmed down from the turmoil, and the new dukes of the north had yet to officially inherit the title of duke. The nobles and civilians had yet to be appeased, but Colin still asked Archbishop Ajani to conduct the funeral for the Duke of St. Hilda. After all, Colin felt uneasy as long as the body of the Duke was not buried. He always felt that something might happen, and the situation that had just been stabilized would become turbulent again. Moreover, Colin was also prepared to take this opportunity to summon all the lords of the northern frontier to Winter City and let them know that the Duke had made Vera the first heir in his will. Of course, in order for Vera to officially become one of the dukes of the north, she still needed to be conferred by Emperor Reinhard. However, now that she had the Duke of St. Hilda's will, Vera had a decisive advantage. Moreover, Scholar Dowan had already prepared a plan to deal with Emperor Reinhard and the Senate. Come from the dust, return to the dust. May your soul rest in peace in the Lord's temple. After Ajani finished reciting the prayer, 4 knights of the House of St. Hilda stepped forward, slowly lifted the Duke's coffin, and walked towards the center of the tomb. As he was a paladin, the Duke of St. Hilda was qualified to be buried in the centermost shrine of the tomb. After the coffin was slowly pushed into the shrine, Vera and Joyce stepped forward and sprinkled a handful of soil on it. At this point, the funeral was over. Colin heaved a sigh of relief. Although he had a tacit understanding with Archbishop Ajani beforehand, Colin could only be sure that she would not go back on her words after the funeral. Of course, there were conditions for Ajani's cooperation. Her condition was that the House of St. Hilda would no longer pursue the Dawson family's betrayal. Colin could guess what the other party wanted to do. Marquis Dawson was dead, and his eldest son, Count Falco, was caught trying to blaspheme Archbishop Ajani, and was arrested by the church. In Colin's eyes, this was clearly a setup. No matter how lustful Count Falco was, he would never attempt to violate Ajani in the church. Akani's goal should be to let Wales inherit the Dawson family's title. This Wales was clearly a fanatic of Akane's, as well as a super bootlicker. This way, Akane would indirectly control the Dawson family. Of course, Colin was very unhappy with this act of poaching the northern frontier, but because he needed to cooperate with the church, he could only pinch his nose and tolerate Johnny's little tricks. In fact, forgiving the Dawson family now was a good thing for the House of St. Hilda. Because what the northern frontier needed the most now was stability. This storm of rebellion caused by the St. Thean family had a wide range of implications. Some people directly participated in the rebellion, some remained neutral, and some had other intentions of colluding with outsiders. In short, what the nobles in the northern frontier were most worried about was whether the House of St. Hilda would settle the score after the event. Forgiving the Dawson family would dispel everyone's concerns. Even the Dawson family, who directly participated in the rebellion, was forgiven. Would the House of St. Hilda continue to pursue the mistakes of other families? Of course, in Colin's eyes, this was only a temporary measure. The northern region was too weak now and could not afford another upheaval. Therefore, he did not intend to start another war. However, after a period of rest and recuperation, and after the northern frontier recovered, he would definitely clean up the northern frontier. For example, the Dawson family, or the Morrison family. Thinking of this, Colin found the figure of Earl Morrison in the crowd of people who came to watch the ceremony. The young Earl's expression was as usual, and there was nothing unusual about him except for the grief that should be there. However, Colin knew that the theft of the Duke's body was most likely the work of this family. Originally, Colin had already prepared a plan to deal with the other party's sudden attack at the funeral, but he did not expect that Earl Morrison did not do anything at all. What was going on? Then what did they want to do by stealing the Duke of St. Hilda's body? Colin had no choice but to suppress his doubts in the bottom of his heart. He held Vera's hand and walked out of the tomb together. Behind them, a group of nobles from the northern frontier also came out one after another. Miss Vera. Vera stopped in her tracks, only to see Count Morrison catching up to her. Viscount Angley. Earl Morrison nodded to Colin again. Colin smiled and did not speak, but he was constantly guessing what the other party wanted to do. Earl Morrison, what can I do for you? Vera asked softly. It's like this. Earl Morrison seemed to be a little embarrassed. I have admired Miss Nina for a long time, so I would like to ask Miss Vera to marry her to me. Sure enough. Colin's heart skipped a beat. Earl Morrison was really here to propose. But he was too anxious. The Duke of St. Hilda had just been buried, and it was too rash of him to propose a marriage alliance right away. Moreover, Vera had not officially inherited the title of Duke yet. Strictly speaking, she was not qualified to marry Nina to Earl Morrison. I'm sorry, Earl Morrison. Vera frowned and said, I am not the master of the Lion's Roar fort yet, and I cannot influence cousin Nina's marriage. Earl Morrison quickly apologized and said, Of course, I understand. So, I am just expressing my feelings to you this time. It will not be too late to arrange a marriage alliance after you inherit the title of Duke. Well, I will think about it, and I will also ask for cousin Nina's opinion. Vera did not directly agree. However, Earl Morrison did not know if he misunderstood Vera's meaning or if he was very confident in himself, but he thanked her again, and then left with satisfaction. Colin, do you think I should marry cousin Nina to Earl Morrison? Vera asked hesitantly. You can ask Nina's opinion first. Colin smiled and said, Moreover, you are not in a hurry. It will not be too late to talk about it after you officially inherit the title of Duke. Okay. Vera nodded. Then, when are we leaving for Imperial Dragon City? Vera officially inherited the title of Duke, and she needed to go to Imperial Dragon City to accept the Emperor's conferment. Colin thought for a while and said, After I complete the prisoner exchange with the Eastern region and bring back Marquis Garcia, we will go to Imperial Dragon City. Otherwise, I will not be at ease if there is no reliable person at the northern frontier. Vera's eyes lit up and she said in surprise, "Have you made an appointment with the Eastern region to exchange the prisoners? Can I go with you? We made an appointment 3 months ago. I thought it would be postponed again, but I didn't expect the time to be just right." Colin patted Vera's little hand, knowing that she was worried about her father, but he still shook his head and said, "I will go by myself if you want to exchange the prisoners. You need to stay in Winter City. Now that the northern frontier has just been settled, we need someone who can make decisions to stabilize the situation." Vera was a little disappointed, but at the same time, she was also a little scared. If I am alone, will I be able to stabilize the situation?" Colin smiled and encouraged her, "You need to have confidence in yourself. You are Saint Hilda, and you are also the first successor appointed by the previous Duke himself. Of course, you will not have any problems. What's more, you still have Scholar Dwayne with you. If you have any political problems, you can discuss them with him. As for military matters, you can absolutely trust Knight Charles and Viscounts Vala." Vera nodded, and she was a little confused. What about Knight Nelson? Can't I trust him completely? Of course, you can trust Knight Nelson, but I am just saying that if the worst happens, you can only entrust your life to Knight Charles and Viscounts Vala. Colin certainly could not tell Vera that Knight Charles and Viscounts Vala were his blood descendants, and there was no possibility of them betraying him. As for the others, well, it was hard to say. Vera nodded, indicating that she had remembered it. "Don't worry, I will be back soon." "Well, be careful." Chapter 284. Alfalfa City was located at the southernmost tip of the Half-Elf Kingdom. The Crystal River and the Raging Water River intersected here, forming a Y shape that divided the city into 3 areas. It was shaped like a 3-leaf clover, hence the name Alfalfa City. The importance of Alfalfa City's geographical location was needless to say, but the strange thing was that this city was a typical, 3-ungoverned area. In fact, if one thought about it carefully, such a situation was not difficult to understand. It was precisely because its geographical location was too important that although the northern frontier and the eastern region wanted to bring it under their rule, they were worried about provoking the other party. Therefore, they tacitly threw it to the Half-Elf Kingdom as a neutral buffer area that no one could touch. For the Half-Elf Kingdom, it was a hot potato that they did not dare to take care of. As a result, Alfalfa City was particularly awkward. There was no lord, no city defense army, and no order. This place gradually became a paradise for adventurers, a gathering place for refugees, and a carnival for anarchists. Strength became the only pass in Alfalfa City. However, Alfalfa City was suddenly quiet today. Even some of the big shots with some influence were obediently dormant. At the same time, they sternly warned their subordinates not to cause trouble for the next few days. This was because several armies had suddenly entered the city, including the famous Black Cavalry. Although there were a lot of lawless bandits and murderers in Alfalfa City, they were at most cockroaches and rats in the shadows. Once they saw a real lion or tiger, they still had to be careful and hide. Otherwise, it was very likely that they would be annihilated. The most majestic building in the north of the city was the Radiance Church. In such a chaotic city, the Radiance Church was one of the few peaceful places. Don't think that evil people did not have faith. In fact, it was the opposite. People who licked blood from their blades every day and did not know when they would die on the streets needed spiritual sustenance more so that they would not go crazy. When Colin walked into the main hall of the church, he saw the figure that had always been on his mind, Queen Aisha. The queen was standing in front of the statue of the Radiance God with her head lowered and eyes closed, praying devoutly. Slightly quickening his pace, Colin came to the side of Queen Aisha. After not seeing her for half a year, Queen Aisha's belly was already bulging. A faintly discernible motherly aura emanated from her body. Coupled with the noble and elegant aura of a queen, she appeared even more alluring. Noticing Colin's arrival, Queen Aisha ended her prayers, turned her head, and revealed a charming smile. I thought you would be late. Knowing that you were waiting for me, of course I would travel day and night. Moreover, don't underestimate the speed of the Black Cavalry. Colin smiled as he stepped forward and carefully pulled Queen Aisha into his embrace. He then captured her tender red lips and tasted the fragrance that he hadn't tasted in a long time. After some tenderness, Queen Aisha leaned on Colin's chest and asked in a lazy tone, "You have an appointment with the Eastern region in 3 days, right?" "Yes, I have sent a messenger to the other side of the river to discuss the exchange of prisoners." Colin held Queen Aisha's waist with one hand and stroked her belly with the other, but it didn't take long before he began to climb up. Queen Aisha snorted, grabbed Colin's mischievous hand, and said, "This is a church." Colin looked down at the snow-white cleavage. His heart was restless, but he had to be honest and asked, "Is there any problem with the food production of the half-elven kingdom this year? This round of turmoil has delayed the spring plowing on the northern frontier. It is estimated that the famine will continue or even worsen. So, I need your help." "No problem," Queen Aisha said confidently. "At the beginning of the year, I deliberately issued a farming order and increased the efforts of the spring plowing. If nothing unexpected happens, this autumn will be a bumper harvest." "That's good." Colin let out a sigh of relief. "As long as we can last through this year, the northern frontier will be able to catch a breather, and everything will slowly get back on track. But, when you send people to buy food this autumn, it's best to bring the army." Queen Aisha's eyes flashed with a hint of sternness. "What's wrong? Is someone not being honest?" "Yes. At the end of last year, you forcefully bought food from Silvermoon City at a low price to aid the northern frontier. This has already made many half-elven merchants and nobles unhappy. If it happens again this year, I'm afraid that some people will overestimate themselves and do something stupid." Colin narrowed his eyes, and his tone became serious. "I understand. After I go back this time, I will let Duke Maudwin lead the Silvermoon Guard back to the half-elven kingdom to help you stabilize the situation in the country." Queen Aisha shook her head gently and said, "There's no rush. I can still stabilize the situation in the half-elven kingdom. Leave the Silvermoon Guard at the northern frontier, you need it more. After the autumn harvest, it won't be too late to let Duke Maudwin come back." Although Colin was still a little worried, he didn't want to refuse Queen Aisha's good intentions. He also didn't want her to think that he doubted her ability to control the situation in the country. "All right. If there are any changes in the situation in Silvermoon City, contact me immediately." "Yes." After a moment of silence, Queen Aisha opened her mouth again. "Recently, the situation in Alfalfa City has been a little strange." Colin didn't mind, and laughed casually. "The regular army has entered the city. Those cockroaches and rats in the shadows have of course hidden." "No, that's not what I meant." Queen Aisha's tone became serious. "Since the beginning of the year, a force called the Alfalfa Brotherhood suddenly rose up in the city. They swept away all the major forces in the city at an extremely fast speed, and have already taken control of Alfalfa City." "Oh." Colin became serious. "Who is the leader of this Alfalfa Brotherhood? Do you know?" "It's a 5th-rank warrior called Capone. He was wanted by the Eastern region because he resisted the Lord's conscription order, and later fled to Alfalfa City. Although his martial strength is outstanding, he didn't mix well in Alfalfa City, a place where dragons and snakes mix together. Until the beginning of this year, he suddenly began to form his own force, and expanded it at an extremely fast speed. Now, he has almost become the nominal master of this city. Someone is supporting him from behind, right?" Colin guessed. "I think so too. Moreover, I suspect that the Eastern region is supporting Capone and the Alfalfa Brotherhood." "Eastern region? Hee, it seems that they aren't honest." Colin's gaze became dangerous. "Yes. However, you don't have to worry too much. After you annihilated the Pegasus Legion in Silvermoon City, the House of St. Prospero lost its most elite troops. They certainly won't be able to touch the northern frontier in a short period of time. Using this kind of underhanded method to try to take control of Alfalfa City, they are worried that the northern frontier will establish a navy in Silvermoon City in the future and go down the Crystal River. Colin thought for a moment, and then said in a deep voice, Alfalfa City can't fall into the hands of the eastern region. Queen Aisha raised her head, looked at Colin, and said, "It's not good to have a conflict with the eastern region at this time, right?" Colin shook his head and said, "Don't worry. Since the eastern region chose to use this kind of underhanded method to take over Alfalfa City, they are also worried about having a direct conflict with the northern frontier. Therefore, it can be seen from this that the eastern region is also weak. Then what are you going to do? Take advantage of the black cavalry in the city and directly destroy the Alfalfa Brotherhood?" Colin stroked Queen Aisha's soft lower abdomen and said, "No, it's better not to use military power to directly interfere. I am also worried that the eastern region will be forced into a corner. If they are desperate and start another war in Alfalfa City, that would not be good. How about this? Alfalfa City is still under the rule of the Half-Elf Kingdom. In the name of the Half-Elf Queen, appoint a city lord of Alfalfa City. Let him unite the forces in the city that are unwilling to submit to the Alfalfa Brotherhood and fight against them. In short, don't let Alfalfa City completely fall into the hands of the eastern region. In the future, when the northern frontier has recovered, they will have an excuse to intervene." Queen Aisha thought for a moment and nodded, "Okay, I will go and find a suitable candidate." "Okay. If the city lord fails and is killed by Capone, you can continue to appoint a new city lord. But never send a regular army into Alfalfa City. Let the jackals and wolves in the city tear each other apart and make it difficult for the Alfalfa Brotherhood to unify the forces in the city." "I understand. There are many lawless and vicious people in Alfalfa City. It won't be difficult to find an opponent for Capone. It will be even easier to make this place chaotic." Colin saw that Queen Aisha understood his intentions so quickly and kissed her on the forehead with approval. Queen Aisha smiled and suggested, "There is a hot spring behind the church. Do you want to soak in it?" "Okay." Colin certainly wouldn't refuse and immediately picked up Queen Aisha. Amidst the others' exclamation, he strode outside. Chapter 285. The gentle afternoon sun shone down on their bodies, making them feel warm. The small boat floating on the raging water river gently swayed along with the waves like a cradle, causing the people on the boat to feel drowsy. Colin stood up and stretched, as if he wanted to use this method to resist the surging drowsiness. There was still some distance to the center of the river where the captives would be changed, so Colin decided to strike up a conversation with Marquis Vincent beside him. "Marquis Vincent, have you gotten used to living in Ice Stone City for the past half-year?" Marquis Vincent snorted lightly and ignored Colin. Half a year as a captive had caused the once high-spirited Marquis of the Eastern region to become much more haggard. However, Colin truly didn't abuse him, he wasn't that bored. Other than the fact that Marquis Vincent didn't have any personal freedom in Ice Stone City, he was provided with good food and drink. Every week, he would even find some skilled women to help him with his physiological needs. At first, Marquis Vincent thought that Colin was humiliating him. He was a Marquis of the Eastern region, the son of a noble holy knight family. How could he touch those lowly women? However, not long after, this noble Marquis of the Eastern region was controlled by his own surging desires and succumbed to the pomegranate skirts of those skilled women. He deeply demonstrated what it meant to say, "You say no, but your body is honest." However, although his physiological needs were satisfied, the mental humiliation caused Marquis Vincent to become thinner and thinner. There was never a moment when he didn't hope to leave that hellish place, Ice Stone City. Now, light had finally appeared. Marquis Vincent didn't want to see Colin's loathsome face for even a moment longer. Facing Marquis Vincent's undisguised loathing, Colin didn't get angry. He chuckled and continued to strike up a conversation. I heard that after you were captured, the Duke of St. Prospero considered making your younger brother, the Earl of Avon, the first successor. Impossible. Hearing this, Marquis Vincent finally opened his mouth. What Colin said was his biggest nightmare after he was captured. Seeing that the other party had finally responded, Colin chuckled and continued, I've met the Earl of Avon once. He's a smart man. If I were the Duke of St. Prospero, I would also consider changing my successor. Marquis Vincent gnashed his teeth in anger. He glared at Colin with undisguised hatred and cursed, if I were your father, I would definitely strangle you to death in your cradle. His defense was broken. Colin shook his head. Marquis Vincent, you've lost your composure. Marquis Vincent snorted and turned his head away, as if he didn't want to talk to Colin anymore. However, Colin opened his mouth again. To be honest, I don't like your younger brother either. When we were in Silvermoon City, he stirred up trouble. Now, he has extended his hand into Alfalfa City. He's really a loathsome guy. Yes, after a few days of investigation, Colin already knew that the backer behind the Alfalfa Brotherhood was the Earl of Avon. Hearing this, Marquis Vincent's expression finally eased a little. He seemed to feel that he and Colin finally shared a common language. He coldly asked, What are you trying to say? Colin sat down opposite Marquis Vincent and smiled. I also don't want to see your brother become the Marquis of the Eastern region. On this point, our interests are the same. So, why don't we cooperate? Marquis Vincent sneered and disdainfully said, Cooperation? Have you forgotten the deep hatred between us? You actually want to cooperate with me? Colin shrugged and innocently said, We have a grudge on the battlefield, but after all, it was an open confrontation between two armies. There's no selfless enmity between us. But your younger brother always uses insidious tricks. He's really annoying. He's simply a disgrace to the aristocracy. Marquis Vincent's expression eased a little. He stared at Colin for a long time and said, My younger brother is indeed annoying. But if you want to stir up the conflict between us and cause the Eastern region to fall into civil strife, I advise you not to waste your energy. Colin still had a smile on his face. He didn't seem to be discouraged by the other party seeing through his scheme. Instead, he gently patted Marquis Vincent's shoulder and affectionately said, Don't be in such a hurry to refuse. I really don't want to see a sinister and cunning guy who always causes trouble for me inherit the position of Duke of the Eastern region. So, you should think about it again. If you need anything in the future, you can contact me at any time. You should also know my current identity. Vera is about to inherit the position of Dukes of the North, and I am her husband. Don't you want to have a strong foreign aid? Marquis Vincent bowed his head in silence. It was unknown whether he was convinced or not. Colin continued, Whether you believe it or not, I am a peace-loving person and Vera is not an ambitious person. Of course, we would prefer a neighbor who is also peace-loving. Marquis Vincent seemed to be finally convinced and whispered, I also don't want to be an enemy of the northern frontier. Colin smiled slightly as he knew that the other party was convinced. However, he didn't continue to persuade him. Too much is as bad as too little. When Marquis Vincent's position in the eastern region was really threatened by his younger brother, he would naturally remember that someone had extended an olive branch to him on the river today. At that time, just as the two were thinking about their own ideas, the boat slowly came to the middle of the river. There was already a luxuriously decorated flower boat parked there. The familiar fragrance of the blood rose filled the air. Apparently, it was Queen Aisha's boat. As the nominal ruler of Alfalfa City, Queen Aisha was the host of this captive exchange ceremony. At the same time as Colin arrived, another boat from the other side of the river was slowly approaching the flower boat. Thump! The gangway was lowered, and Colin and Marquis Vincent boarded the flower boat one after another. As soon as Colin stood on the deck, he saw the Earl of Avon and Marquis Garcia on the other side. After not seeing him for a long time, Marquis Garcia's hair was already white and he was also leaning on crutches. Apparently, the fiasco left him with injuries that were difficult to recover from. Although his eyes were still sharp, he no longer had the invincible momentum that he used to have. Colin sighed inwardly and then went forward to exchange greetings. Marquis Garcia had an indifferent expression as he greeted Colin and even nodded to his enemy, Marquis Vincent, as if he had forgotten everything. Marquis Vincent was also stunned. He obviously didn't expect Marquis Garcia to be so kind to him. In contrast, he and his younger brother, the Earl of Avon, had a strong smell of gunpowder between them. Queen Aisha leisurely walked in front of everyone and said with a smile, "The Lord once said that all hatred, resentment, and malice should be removed from your hearts. Only by treating each other with kindness, compassion, and forgiveness can you be redeemed." After saying that, she asked the maid to bring 5 glasses of wine and handed them to everyone. When everyone raised their glasses one after another, Queen Aisha continued, "Let us drink this glass together, in order to forgive each other, in order to redeem the Lord." Colin and the others followed suit and drained their cups in one gulp. The atmosphere eased slightly. The Earl of Avon looked at Colin and said with a smile, "Viscount Angley, I heard that the chaos at the northern frontier has been resolved. Congratulations." Colin also replied with a smile, "Thank you for your concern. In the end, evil can't defeat justice." Count Elvin nodded solemnly and said in an extremely sincere tone, "Don't worry. You're right. The House of St. Thean has forgotten their mission and honor. They actually did the evil thing of sacrificing a city. Their sin is unforgivable. If Prince Rhy hadn't killed Mr. Chi, the House of St. Prospero would have sent people to assist the House of St. Hilda in getting rid of this evil wizard." Colin smiled politely and didn't say anything. He obviously wouldn't take the other party's words seriously. The Earl of Avon's eyes moved slightly and continued, "Although Mr. Chi has received his due trial, as far as I know, the House of St. Thean still has some fish that escaped the net." Hearing this, Colin's interest was piqued. He asked, "Oh? Who are the remaining members of the House of St. Thean? Where are they hiding now? Mr. Chi's whereabouts are very secretive. It's very difficult to find out who the House of St. Thean still have. However, I do know the whereabouts of one of his sons." "Where?" The Earl of Avon pointed to the shore and said, "In Alfalfa City." Colin narrowed his eyes and asked, "What's his name?" The Earl of Avon spread his hands and said, "I didn't find out." Colin sneered in his heart. He obviously didn't believe this nonsense. It seemed that the Earl of Avon didn't want to say. However, Colin didn't intend to pursue the matter. With Mr. Chi's death, the House of St. Thean was nothing to be afraid of in Colin's view. What kind of threat could a family without its own territory and army be? The Earl of Avon turned to look at Queen Aisha and said with a smile, "Your Majesty, I heard that you have recently found a new lord of Alfalfa City." "Yes." Queen Aisha nodded gently. The Earl of Avon had a mysterious smile on his face and said to Colin, "Viscount Angley, if you want to find the remaining member of the House of St. Thean, shouldn't you seek the help of the Lord of Alfalfa City?" Colin nodded lightly and said, "I will." However, the Earl of Avon's mysterious smile made Colin start to have wild thoughts. Could it be that the Lord of Alfalfa City that Queen Aisha had found was the remaining member of the House of St. Thean? "Then I wish you good luck." The Earl of Avon immediately took his leave and left the boat with Marquis Vincent. Colin glanced at Marquis Garcia and asked respectfully, "Lord Marquis, shall we go back?" "Yes." Marquis Garcia nodded and stared at the water, seemingly not in the mood to talk. Colin gave Queen Aisha a meaningful look and then the boat began to slowly turn around and sail towards the shore. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.